off in Utah could be used for a controversial water pipeline. The parcels of land marked for sale in this proposal, coincidentally, line up with the land in Utah that has been targeted for the so-called Lake Powell pipeline. This proposed pipeline has greatly concerned water managers in Nevada, Arizona, California, Colorado, New Mexico, and Wyoming. These are 6 of the 7 states that depend on the Colorado River, every one except Utah. If this land is sold and the pipeline is built, this could divert 28 billion gallons of water each year from Lake Powell and the Colorado River to communities in southern Utah, away from Nevada, Arizona, and other basin states. Look, Amadei did not consult local authorities in southern Nevada, and it shows, because he clearly doesn't understand the relationship between water and development and housing costs. I support the Titus Amendment. I'm asking you to advance my amendment to repeal the Amadei land sale in Utah so we can stop this Trojan horse to steal Nevada's water. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Langworthy, you have any questions? No. Mr. McGovern?
Ms. Sewell, I don't know, did you have anything else you wanted to add?
Yeah. Yes, you know, I was starting to talk about the effects of this horrible bill on public schools and the fact that the school vouchers are now being federalized. I mean, there are lots of states, including my own state, that gives tax credit to parents who put their money in a, foundation. They call it a foundation. There are no requirements as to who's eligible. So what happens is that lots of parents who already have their kids in private school now will have an opportunity, one for one, to get those, to get that a tax credit for that. And in my state of Alabama, a lot of those private schools popped up as a way of avoiding all deliberate speed in Brown versus Board of Education and created these segregated academies. And so I don't want this bill to give further credence to these vouchers being about choice when there are very little choices when you have small communities that are made up of 5,000 people and there's one public school and there's only one academy, and that academy is still all white in 2025. And, as a public school kid and parents who grew up, parents who were public school teachers, and my mom was a librarian and my dad was a high school basketball coach, I can tell you that in Selma, when I was growing up, the best school was Selma High School. It was Selma High School that sent kids off full scholarships to Duke and to other places. It wasn't the private academy that was private but didn't have a full array of sports or debate team or any of that. And I don't want to, as a member of Congress, promote these vouchers, which are, and this bill gives $5 billion, set aside of $5 billion for these private school vouchers. So thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to talk about it. And I know that these private schools don't have to take the disabled or special ed kids. They have very different standards.
Yeah, so thank you for that. And to everybody on the panel, thank you for your amendment. Thank you for waiting around. Thank you for, again, your passion and your commitment to trying to make this bill better. I support them all, and I'm just so grateful that you are here. I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Sewell, you just said something, though, that I have to correct, because in this bill with the vouchers, if a student does have an IEP, that has to be honored if the student goes into a school with a scholarship. So you are mistaken, I have to say, for the schools. That is a part of that piece of legislation. So they do have to take students who have IEPs. If they're in the public schools and they have IEPs and they transfer.
Well, I can just tell you that in Alabama state, because they're going to get both. And I understand what you're saying, but clearly, because schools are mostly controlled by the states.
But in this legislation, there is a provision on that. It may not be true in Alabama, but it is true in this legislation. Okay. Thank you, Ms. Scanlon. You're recognized.
Thank you. I would just add, however, that the way that would be enforced would be through the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights, which has just been gutted by the Trump administration. So
That's a very good point.
thank you. I did that work for a long time. Mr. Levin, I think you mentioned that the bill would raise energy costs for families. Is that right? Can you give me that figure?
Yep, by 7%, about $110 a year.
Okay, so if the energy costs for the family are going to go up by $107 per year and their tax break is going to be $265 per year, we've already eliminated half of that. And then if they're going to have problems with their health care costs because we've cut Medicaid and we're eliminating the ACA credits, you begin to see how the budget office has determined that the prices for average families are going to go up.
Well, this is a lousy deal. So if you're making, the statistics I saw is if you're making under $51,000 a year, you're going to wind up with $700 in increase taxes, tax burden per year. And if you make over $4.3 million, your taxes are going to go down by an average of $389,000. So the rich get richer, and that's what these folks want to do.
Okay. And Ms. Castor, you were talking, one of your amendments deals with having HHS investigate the potential for Medicaid fraud. Isn't that something that inspectors general would do for HHS under ordinary times when we had an inspector general?
That's correct. And in fact, just today, the Senate Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee issued a major report on the impact of Trump's firing of all of the inspectors general, the folks who, these are the cops on the beat that root out waste, fraud, and abuse. You're right. If we don't have the cops on the beat, if we don't fund them through our appropriations, that's money lost to the taxpayer.
Right. And in the past, I think the inspector general has found Medicaid fraud in Florida to the tune of $1.something billion with the Columbia Hospital System.
That is correct. Unfortunately, Florida is a magnet for a lot of the fraudsters. We have a lot of older neighbors, a lot of retirees that are often subjected to this. But I mean, it knows no bounds. So why don't we instead of creating this false narrative that there's a hardworking person with a child with a complex condition trying to rip off Medicaid, it's often these large-scale schemes by different insurance providers or managed care providers, and that's where the focus should be.
Well, and that was the presumption that I wanted to push back against, this idea that you have individuals who are out there committing fraud against Medicaid when, in fact, the big dollars that do from time to time get wasted, get defrauded, tend to be from large-scale providers, and that's the kind of thing that we do need these inspectors to root out. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for everyone who's still waiting in the wings. We'll continue the rules rave as we head into our 16th hour. So thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Scanlon. Mr. Nagush, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to our colleagues for your testimony, for your patience, for being here on behalf of your constituencies. I want to talk a bit with my colleagues from the West, with Ms. Titus and Ms. Lee, about what I think to be one of the most insidious provisions of this bill, which was this midnight public lands sale. And both of you articulated well what makes this provision so problematic, so repugnant, something that I actually thought Republican leadership would have already removed. Perhaps we'll see that in the manager's amendment. Time will tell. But I think insofar as neither of your amendments are accepted in order and this language isn't removed from the bill, I think it would be violative of a core norm that has governed land conveyances and the consideration of land conveyances by this body for a long time. So just to kind of unpack that, as you know, I serve as the ranking member on the Federal Land Subcommittee. One of the most bipartisan subcommittees in the Congress. It was the most productive subcommittee in the last Congress. We marked up more bills than any other subcommittee in the House. The vast majority of them are bipartisan, mostly on suspension, most regarding land conveyances. Those typically are done through regular order, a legislative hearing. Were these land sales considered as a part of a legislative hearing? Ms. Lee?
No, they were not. In fact, the amendment was literally unusually dropped right before it was heard, rather than at the beginning of the markup hearing.
That's precisely right. Ms. Titus, was Were they considered in a markup prior to being included in this bill?
No, they weren't, and furthermore, that we were not informed about them in advance. As you well know, any kind of public land decisions go through a long process. Stakeholders come, you have public hearings, local elected officials weigh in, BLM plays a role. None of that happened. This was just dropped all of a sudden, and to add insult to injury, it is in a district that Mr. Amadei does not represent. It's in my district. And it goes against all of the SNPLMA provisions that have been in place for years, where the money from land sales in Nevada returns to Nevada to be used to save Lake Tahoe, to do bicycle trails, energy conservation, firefighting, even some goes to education. None of that was considered.
Yeah, it, as I said, violates every norm in the book. No legislative hearing, no legislative markup, introduced at the dead of night without any consultation with the colleagues who actually represent the areas in question. It's opposed by the local counties, opposed by the congressional representation, opposed by the U.S. senators who represent the state in question. And I just have to say to my colleagues, and it gives me I don't enjoy saying it, majorities come, majorities go. And my colleagues will have reaped what they sow insofar as this measure is included. And I made that case to Chairman Tiffany on the Public Lands Subcommittee, just to give you a sense of what this looks like so that we just kind of understand what the future holds. I haven't had the privilege of visiting Mr. Langworthy's district. I hope one day, maybe I'll get an invitation, but just so he's aware, I would hope that he makes the case to Mr. Tonko and Mr. Morelli and the neighboring districts that are adjacent to his, let's say Chautauqua County, for example. Because if Mr. Morelli comes to the Public Lands Subcommittee, if we're in the majority 18 months from now, and says, you know what, I think I'd like to pursue a wilderness designation in Chautauqua County. I don't represent Chautauqua County. Nicholas Langworthy represents Chautauqua County. But I know the county is against this measure, but that's okay. I think we should proceed. There'll be no legislative hearing. There'll be no legislative markup. There'll be no consideration of how your constituents feel. If we applied the principle that you're applying today, that land measure would be on the floor for full consideration by the body without a moment's care for your position on it. And so I am again in awe that we haven't been able to convince my colleagues that this is not a precedent that they want to establish. I suppose we'll see what happens on the floor. Last point I'll make, Ms. Lee pointed this out. I was unaware when this was introduced about the water diversion project. I mean, this is part of the reason I suspect why they introduced it in the dead of night in the land sale, because it would be disastrous for the state of Arizona. And I don't know how any of my colleagues from Arizona on the Republican or Democratic side are going to justify a vote against protecting their water sources. It makes no sense to me how they're going to rationalize that. Had this been vetted in a legislative hearing, we would have had an opportunity to hear from the Bureau of Reclamation and the various water authorities and have the necessary sunlight to expose this. We were deprived of that opportunity. And now you have 6 basin states, all including the state of Colorado, the headwaters of the Colorado River, as Ms. Lee knows, are in my district, opposing this effort. And I hope we'll hear, I certainly plan on spending some time on the floor on this issue, and I would welcome my colleagues from Arizona, my Republican colleagues, if Mr. Gosar is watching somewhere in the building, I would welcome him to the floor, because I'd love to hear what his response would be. Ms. Lee?
And for that matter, any colleague from the West who has a large percentage of federally controlled land in their state, who traditionally this type of move would never be made, one, without any input from a representative from the district in which the land is, which is mine, and or any county official. So I know that Representative Zinke has led an effort to withdraw this amendment, and I hope that other Republicans join him.
Yeah, I couldn't say it better, and I appreciated Mr. Zinke's leadership, frankly, in pushing that forward. I support his effort, and we'll just have to see. But in the interim, if folks have ideas about, potential wilderness designations, in Western Virginia, or perhaps parts of northern Minnesota, or Chautauqua County in New York. We're taking ideas, and we've got 17 months, I guess, to do that. So anyway, I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize Ms. Ledger Fernandez.
Thank you. I'm supposed to use this one. Thank you very much. And, I think that this testimony that we've heard today and all day long really talks about that there are a lot of transfers going on in this bill, right? Transfers from working families to the wealthy. Transfers, in your instance, I think you wanted to talk a little bit more about the idea that we're transferring resources from public schools. And what does that then mean for the children of those public schools? The transfer of wealth away from the children who need it most with the child tax credit to those who need it the least, right? It would be my guess that my kids are too old now, but I could make do without that child tax credit. But somebody who's making $15,000 could really use it. And Representative Del Bene, and I think this education piece to the both of you goes to what does it mean for a child to have the right kind of education, but also the child tax credit removes the stress that is in a household that has high poverty. And Republicans refuse to expand, to continue the expanded child tax credit they have. Could you just real quickly, maybe the two of you, just some quick thoughts on that impact on the children's education?
Well, we know when we had the expanded child tax credit in place, we cut childhood poverty across the country almost in half in just a year. Childhood poverty costs us $1 trillion a year in the United States. So not only is this important policy because it supports families, helps our kids get off to a great start, it also is fiscally responsible policy and actually saves us money. So the challenge that we face in this bill is that 17 million kids across the country are left out because their parents don't make enough money to have the tax burden to get the full credit. And what we did previously with the expanded child tax credit is we said we are going to make sure that the families who need the most, the lowest income families, they may not make enough to have a huge tax burden. We're going to make sure they get the full benefit. And when what did people spend that money on? On housing, on food, on school supplies, making sure their kids were doing okay. It's an incredible investment, but those 17 million kids across our country who are in the most need, they won't receive the full benefit in the way this bill is written. We can fix that. We've done it before.
And we need to trust families to make those decisions.
And we know it works.
What's fascinating is that Republicans sort of, they want to say no regulations, but boy, do they regulate families. I don't know if you want to have, you said you wanted to add something more, so that's why I think I wanted to make sure we gave everybody
I just
a
really
chance.
wanted to, I think that this is a further, we're further degrading public education. I mean, the education is a great equalizer. It gives people opportunities. It can level the playing field. And when you take away and siphon public dollars that should go to public schools and you're giving tax credits for private schools, I think we're sending the wrong message. And I can tell you that Head Start gives people a head start. And when you are taking money away from public education, you're decreasing the amount of chemistry labs we have, better libraries that we have, books and teachers for that matter. And I just think that it is a transfer of wealth and of dollars from one to another. And it's sort of like Robin Hood. You're taking from the least of these and giving it to the most of these.
Thank you. And of course, we have let's tax the billionaires. That would be the right way to do the transfer. And thank you very much for bringing that amendment, right? Like if you don't want to benefit if you want to make sure that there isn't the transfer of wealth going the wrong way, that's what your amendment does, and I thank you very much for it. And then finally, there we are on, making sure that we are losing the battle for renewable energy. And thank you for championing those. And then finally, the respect that we should have for due process for our immigrant population, and to say, let's stop demonizing our immigrants because they pick the food. Somebody was saying, well, it's the farmers who do the food, who produce the food. You cannot, demonize the farmers earlier today. But actually, who's the one who's actually picking that food and, helping care for our elders, helping care for our children, all of that. And I think that what you all did today on this panel was bring all those many aspects of this bill to light. And so I'm very grateful that you did that. And once again, we have a room full of colleagues who are bringing some other great amendments to bear here. And so with that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back, and that concludes this panel. Thank you all for being here. And we're going to look forward to the next panel stepping forward as we let those get out first before we have a big shift. Starting on this end, so that we have everybody in order. Ms. Lofgren, Ms. Houlihan, Ms. Underwood, Mr. Swazi, Ms. Rivas, Mr. Goldman, Mr. Moskowitz, and Ms. Morrison.
Moskowitz? Yeah, Moskowitz. Here we go. We had Comer this morning. We had Comer this morning. He was terrible.
Yeah, he was here. Weren't you? Oh, no, you weren't here earlier. I didn't actually, I missed his.
Your chair number 3.
Well, I hear you.
Yeah, I only.
All right.
People didn't get to ask a question.
I know some of you all have been here for some time. We've still got at least 1 or 2 more panels to go after this. So, Ms. Lofgren, I'm going to recognize you to go ahead and get started, and hopefully everybody will settle down here real quick. The floor is yours.
Thank you
have 5
very
minutes.
much, Mr. Chairman and committee. There's a lot to dislike in this big, bad bill, but many of my colleagues have addressed some of the most pernicious elements, reducing health care for Americans, increasing costs for Americans, nutrition cuts for Americans. I want to address something else with my amendments. We need to grow our economy if we want to have a prosperous country. And key to that is to make sure that our science enterprise is not destroyed. My first 3 amendments deal with the Trump administration's threats to significantly cut indirect cost funding provided to universities and other research partners by the National Institutes of Health, Department of Energy, the National Science Foundation, and other federal agencies. The administration has proposed capping those costs at 15%. That is ill-informed and completely arbitrary. These indirect costs are not unnecessary. They're the funds that are used to pay the electricity for labs, to feed the lab animals, to make sure that the research can be done. And they are carefully negotiated in each case with the grantees. To cap them is just to cut the science, and it's a big problem for America's future. Many of these research universities are not just in blue states, they're in Republican-led districts and states, and it's going to hurt not only science in the country, but your districts as well as all of ours. The Idaho National Labs posted something recently indicating that up to 85% of GDP growth in America is directly connected with science. And so the science reductions that we are seeing that are being undertaken are going to have a direct adverse impact to our economy and to our future prosperity. I have an amendment dealing with broadening participation in the science area. The current administration has severely cut science agencies' work on broadening participation. In some cases, they've ignored or defied explicit congressional direction in law, and I will add that that direction was always adopted on a bipartisan basis in the Science Committee. We've known for a long time that there are parts of the American population that is lagging behind in science participation, including people in rural communities, women. We can't afford to write off any zip code in the United States. If we don't address this disparity, we're going to lose our competition with China, which has more than 4 times the population of America. So if we don't include all Americans, we lose to China. This amendment addresses the short-sighted actions by the Trump administration. Finally, I have 2 amendments that deal with agriculture, the Specialty Crop Block Grants Program and the Specialty Crop Research Initiative. While the Skinny Farm Bill has some provisions I would support in a vacuum, I have serious concerns that the bill does not do enough to ensure the competitiveness of our agricultural industry, given the context of what the Trump administration is doing to the ag industry. As the chaos of the Trump administration and DOJ's senseless cuts continue across the USDA, we're already seeing a brain drain as highly trained staff with extremely specialized expertise leave or are fired. At this year's joint session, I invited a Salinas scientist, a PhD-level scientist, U.S. Air Force veteran, who had been fired despite receiving a recent positive performance review. His situation represented one of the many mindless firings by Trump and Musk that undermines the country's science and innovation prowess. Diminishing agricultural research capacity in my district, America's Salad Bowl, is unwise. Monterey County agriculture pumps more than $1.3 million into the local economy each hour of every day. USDA scientists like my guest conduct important research and development projects that boost American innovation and help keep food on our tables. The U.S. will no longer be the envy of the world if the administration keeps firing smart, capable public servants advancing America's best interests. Yet, this reconciliation package pretends that these cuts aren't happening, and I'm here to say that they are. My amendments would undo them and promote economic growth and prosperity, and I see my time is up, so I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentlelady. Now recognize the gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Ms. Houlihan, for her 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'm here to speak on behalf of the close to 750,000 members of my community, as well as the military in this conversation here. This bill is simply a slapshot and irresponsible bill. In many cases, it's quite hateful. In fact, just a few hours ago, one of my Republican colleagues described it to me as a hot mess. So I believe that we are in a place where we need to figure out if there's any sort of amendments that we can be doing that are common sense and that might hopefully prevent some of the harmful and destructive fates from befalling the American people. So I have a few amendments that I'd like to introduce, and each of them prevents this bill, if it moves forward, maybe helps to hurt fewer people less, whether they're veterans or students or the middle-class Americans, and anyone who might be worried about national security. And I would argue that everyone should be worried about national security. The first of my amendments is that none of these funds will be available if this bill increases taxes or the cost of living expenses for those making $400,000 or less. I'm going to say I shamefully stole this from a fellow Pennsylvanian who offered this exact amendment during the IRA. And so it feels as though what's good for the goose is good for the gander, and it feels like that this should be a really good opportunity to add this amendment, and no one should disagree with that. While Republicans claim to care about lowering grocery prices and the cost of living, the reality is that both have gone up under President Trump's leadership. My community learned that the hard way the last time Republicans jammed forward their tax bill, and in my community particularly, it actually raised taxes for many of our families and provided giveaways to many of the wealthiest and to many large corporations as well. So the next thing that I will offer is this big, beautiful bill is a second amendment, which is one that I actually offered during the Armed Services markup. And this amendment was offered first and named the delay of effective date of this bill until Pete Hegseth is no longer the Secretary of Defense. Right? If you've watched me over the past 6 years in Congress, you know that I am passionate about national security, and you know that I've worked really hard to provide our warfighters with everything that this nation can provide and our armed forces needs to face the threats of today and of our future wars, which is why I cannot and we should not, in good faith, effectively give a blank check to the Department of Defense for $150 billion additional dollars of investment with somebody like Secretary Hegseth at the helm. He has proven himself to be incompetent, to be reckless, to be willful, and frankly, to be paranoid as well. And he cannot and absolutely should not be trusted with the responsibility of these, our most precious resources, our soldiers, our sailors, our airmen, our Marines, and our the Air Space Force Guardians, thank you, the fun uniforms. So until such time as Secretary Hegseth is no longer serving as our Secretary of Defense and no longer threatening our national security and that of this world, the authorization of $150 billion will not be unlocked and this bill will not be in effect. And finally, none of these funds may be used to dismantle the VA or benefits, including those of Coatesville VA. At a time when President Trump and the administration has been implementing sweeping and super chaotic structural changes at our Department of Veterans Affairs, we must ask ourselves who is indeed bearing the responsibility of this instability. The answer, unfortunately, is sometimes that the men and women who have worn the uniform of the United States, many of whom we will observe this Memorial Day weekend, those who have faced combat and endured, in some cases, lifelong injuries and sacrificed not just their time, but often their peace of mind, their health, their families, their well-being, and their lives, those are the people who deserve the stability, the transparency, and the unwavering support, not a system in disarray and an administration that have used them as line items in a budget. Which is why this amendment will ensure that none of the funds will be used to dismantle VA facilities, veteran services, or benefits, including those at my Coatesville VA Medical Center. And finally, none of the funds authorized under this act may be expended until such time as all funding that has been allocated amongst the rescue plan, the American Rescue Plan's elementary and secondary school emergency relief, or ESSER, has been allocated. Specifically in my community, the Reading, Pennsylvania School District, $51,363,310 that were appropriated and allocated by this Congress were clawed back by this administration, forcing our STEM building, our high school STEM building, in one of the nation's poorest areas to no longer be able to be built. So until such time as those funds are re-released, those appropriately, legally, constitutionally appropriated funds are re-released, this bill will not be enacted. With that, those are the several opportunities that I think for improving this bill. I urge this committee to make these amendments in order, please. I urge this committee to take stock of what American people are really actually telling us, and I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you, Chairman.
The gentlelady yields back. Now recognize the gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Underwood.
Thank you. Thank you. I join you today to speak on behalf of the millions of Americans who stand to lose their health care based on which amendments this committee decides to move forward with today. While most of the country was asleep, the Republican majority on this committee has been working to rush this legislation through the night to please Donald Trump and hand a massive tax cut to all those billionaires that were in the front row of the inauguration. And if that wasn't enough, you're making American families pay for it by kicking Americans off of health care coverage, closing nursing homes and rural hospitals, and taking no action to protect critical resources like the enhanced premium tax credits that keep families afloat. So I, alongside my colleague, Representative Horsford, am here to offer our Republican colleagues an opportunity to do the right thing, to put American families first and lower health care costs. Our amendment, Amendment 245, would make permanent the expiring enhanced premium tax credits that have already delivered historic savings for millions of Americans. This amendment is based on my Health Care Affordability Act, which I first introduced in 2019 and fought so hard to get a short-term version signed into law in the American Rescue Plan and then later extended through the Inflation Reduction Act. Because of this legislation, more Americans than ever before have access to quality, affordable health care through marketplace plans. This year, we once again have a record-breaking enrollment with more than 24 million Americans enrolling in coverage, 22 million of whom will receive tax credits to lower their out-of-pocket costs. Families of four who get their health care through the Affordable Care Act are saving an average of $2,400 per year on their annual premiums thanks to these tax credits. 4 out of 5 customers can get a plan for $10 or less per month. Let me be clear. These tax credits benefit and are favored by Americans across the country on both sides of the aisle. In farm country, these tax credits save family farmers an average of $506 per month, over $6,000 a year for farmers. In the chair's own district, not you, Mr. Chairman, but in Chair Fox's own district, this policy saved constituents an estimated average of $696 on their premiums in 2024. Across the district of every one of my Republican colleagues on this Rules Committee, these tax credits delivered at least an estimated $468 in annual savings to constituents and as high as $804 in Indiana. It's no surprise that Donald Trump's own pollster, Mr. Fabrizio, found that these tax credits are popular and highly supported by swing and Trump voters. And they're supported by a broad range of providers, healthcare systems, and patient advocates too. Because these tax credits don't just work, they provide an essential lifeline for families across the country, and we cannot let them expire. This tax package is already a disaster for working families, and without this amendment, it's catastrophic. Without it, healthcare costs will skyrocket, and over 4 million people will be priced out of healthcare. That's on top of the 8.6 million people that are already being kicked off of Medicaid by this tax bill. I urge my colleagues across the aisle to stand in solidarity with the American families instead of billionaires by supporting this amendment. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. Gentlelady yields back. Now recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Swazi, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Acting Chairman and Ranking Member and all of my colleagues. I know you've had a very long night, and we appreciate you taking the time to listen to our important concerns. I'm going to talk to you about the state and local tax deduction, also known as SALT. Under the current law, the SALT deduction has been capped at $10,000. And under the existing reconciliation bill, it's been raised to $30,000. We haven't seen the manager's amendment yet. We're talking about all the different negotiations that are going on. But we believe that's very inadequate, or I believe it's very inadequate. And in fact, 6 of my Republican colleagues have come out and said it's insulting to only raise it to $30,000. And they said they will not vote for this bill at that level. So I know there's a lot of negotiations going on. But I want everybody to understand the basics of the state and local tax deduction. Before 1913, the only time we had an income tax was during the Civil War. Lincoln had put it in place, it was declared unconstitutional. That was changed in 1913. We said we're going to create a federal income tax. And the governors and the mayors of the different states and cities throughout the country said, we don't want a federal income tax because we have to take care of our schools, and we have to pay our police officers, and we have to pick up the garbage and take care of the roads, and we need to tax at the local level. And we want the federal government to continue to raise your revenues from tariffs and from customs and things like that. And the federal government said, no, don't worry about it. We're going to create a state and local tax deduction so that you will not be taxed at the federal level on the taxes you've already paid at the state and local level. And that was a covenant between the states and the federal government for over 100 years until 2017, when the majority party at the time, the same majority party as now, and the president put a cap on the state and local tax deduction at $10,000. Now, that really was a body blow to a lot of different states, not just my state of New York, but also other states like New Jersey and California and Connecticut and Illinois and Massachusetts and Maryland and Michigan and Minnesota and Oregon and Pennsylvania and Virginia and Hawaii. These states were hurt dramatically because when we set up our government in the United States of America, we wanted our states and cities to be laboratories of democracy where they could experiment with what's the best way to run their governments. And then the federal government would not tax people on an expense that they were mandated to pay at the local level. So our taxes are higher in New York State, for example, and some other high tax states, because we've decided we want to insure our children. We have the lowest rate of uninsured children in the United States of America in New York State. We have the lowest rate of uninsured adults. We have subways and mass transit. We pay our teachers and our firefighters and our police officers good wages and give them good benefits. And that experiment worked. In fact, we've been a very productive state, so much so that we've contributed much more to the federal government in federal income taxes than we actually get back in services from the federal government. We are net donors to the federal government. In fact, most of the states hardest hit by the state and local tax deduction cap are donors to the federal government, where most of the states not affected that have low taxes are net takers from the federal government, with the exception of Texas. So it's just patently unfair that we broke this covenant, this idea of federalism, with a long arm of the federal government reached into our local municipalities and said, we don't like the way you're taxing your people. We don't like what you're doing. We don't think you should pay your teachers. We don't think you should pay your police officers. We don't think you should pay your firefighters. We don't think that you should insure your children. In fact, the highest rate of uninsured children in the country are in Florida and Texas, low tax states. They chose not to do that. Now, right now, they're booming. And we're in trouble in some of our higher tax states. People are leaving our states and going to these other states. And you know what happens when people leave our states and go to the lower tax states? The people that are left behind, the middle class and the lower income people, are left holding the bag. And their taxes are either going to go up or their services are going to be cut, and neither one of those is acceptable. So as a matter of basic fairness, I'm asking that this amendment be adopted by the Rules Committee that increases the state and local tax deduction cap to $80,000. Nobody wants to pay the full restoration. I understand that. As a compromise, I'm suggesting that we increase the state and local deduction cap to $80,000. And let's pay for that. Let's not add to the deficit as this current bill does, which is creating some of the biggest deficits in the history of the United States of America. Let's pay for it by raising the top rate for the highest income earners in America from 37 back to 39.6. It's only fair. It's only fair that these donor states that take care of their residents, that do the best job that they can in their laboratory of democracy, are not penalized for doing what they see as being the right thing to do. That was a covenant between the federal government and the states and local governments for over 100 years. With that, I yield back, and I thank you for your time and attention.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize Ms. Rivas of California.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Ranking Member. I want to start by thanking Ranking Member Pallone for providing me with the opportunity to lead this important amendment on a subject that is quickly becoming part of our everyday lives, artificial intelligence, or AI. From healthcare to housing to banking, AI is playing a critical role in all areas of our lives. AI is evolving every day, which is why it demands swift attention and continuous action to keep Americans safe. State legislatures from across the country have enacted their own laws, including legislation that limits bias in the housing, healthcare, and financial sectors, as well as actions that protect the health and safety of users from harmful AI systems. Despite all these positive developments, there's currently a provision in this Republicans' big bill that would issue a 10-year moratorium on states' ability to enforce AI laws. My amendment strikes this moratorium. This 10-year ban would remove states' ability to establish or enforce state laws that help keep up with the technological evolutions of AI, as well as push back on deliberate designs that could harm Americans. Under this ban, state and local governments won't be able to enforce current, new, or updated regulations around AI use in the workplace, in procurement, guidelines, or in eliminating biases, even regulations that only impact their specific locality. As a former state legislator, I believe we can and should learn from the states and champion solutions that protect Americans, especially workers and children, from harmful AI systems and not put unnecessary stoppages on their progress. Regardless of where you are on AI policy, enacting this moratorium is bad practice. AI has shown tremendous potential to improve and enhance our lives, but if we do not take immediate action to address the threats it poses on consumers as they arise today, we will not be prepared to address the threats that could arise over the next 10 years as a result. I'd like to submit a letter for the record. This letter to Speaker Johnson was signed by over 100 organizations, such as Unidos US, the National Immigration Law Center, National Women's Law Center, and SEIU, in opposition to this provision that's tucked into this bill. In their letter to the Speaker, the organizations state that as we have seen during other periods of rapid technological advancement, like the Industrial Revolution, the creation of the automobile, protecting people from being harmed by new technologies, including holding companies accountable when they cause harm, will spur innovation and the adoption of new technologies. The Republican moratorium on AI will block new innovation from occurring. AI policy touches every aspect of American lives now, and most certainly will over in the next 10 years. Thank you for considering my amendment. I urge its adoption, and I look forward to answering any questions.
And what was the date on the letter?
May 19, 2025.
And without objection, so ordered. All right, now recognize Mr. Goldman of New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm here to introduce two amendments, but I want to say just a couple things about the broader bill before I get to them. And most of what I'm about to say is really directed at blatantly false statements that many of my Republican colleagues have said, are saying, and likely will say about this bill. First, this bill slashes Medicaid, cuts Medicaid. More than 8 million Americans will lose their health care because of this bill. You can sugarcoat it all you want with eligibility and work requirements and any waste, fraud, and abuse, but the reality is that that's dressing up a pig, and it is cutting Medicaid. Second, the bill increases taxes for the poorest Americans and dramatically reduces taxes for the wealthiest. If you make less than $51,000 a year, your taxes will go up $700. If you make more than $4.3 million a year, which is the top 0.1% of Americans, your taxes will go down by nearly $400,000. That is reducing taxes for the wealthy and increasing taxes for the poor. Third, this bill repeals tax credits for American energy production that has resulted in hundreds of thousands of jobs created in this country and hundreds of billions of dollars of investment in American manufacturing. The vast majority of both of those are in red districts. These credits also reduce energy prices and increase our energy independence. Two things that the America First gang endlessly talk about. And yet, this bill cuts all of that progress. And finally, you will hear my Republican colleagues say that cuts to essential government programs are needed to reduce an exploding deficit. That's nonsense. This bill increases the deficit by at least $3 trillion. So much so that Moody's became the last of the 3 major ratings agencies to downgrade U.S. debt. Now, this deficit increase will increase annual interest payments on our debt to 9% of total GDP in 10 years. 9%. That is just unsustainable. And yet it is the Republicans who are jamming this through. Now, my amendments address 2 separate things. One is a very simple amendment that I was shocked did not receive unanimous support in the Judiciary Committee, Amendment 258. It simply says that no federal funding can be used to deport American citizens. Remarkably, every Republican in the Judiciary Committee voted against it, and I hope this committee does not. My second amendment, Amendment 135, addresses what is truly a cruel and cynical attempt to make America hungry again. This bill does not trim SNAP around the edges. It does not cut waste, fraud, and abuse. It cuts SNAP to its core, to the tune of approximately $250 billion, which may sound like an abstract number, but there are human lives at stake. There are children who will go hungry. There are seniors who have to choose between prescription drugs and food. There are working parents who rely on that few $100s a month to put food on their table. My amendment would strike one of the most damaging provisions of this bill, a provision that would shift 75% of the administrative costs onto the states, up from current 50% split. In my district in New York City, more than 118,000 of my constituents use SNAP to put food on the table. And across New York State, 1 in 7 residents depend on it. This bill wouldn't just cut the benefits, it would starve the program. The GOP's proposed changes to SNAP would create a new burden on New York State of over $2.1 billion. And let's be real, what happens when administrative costs shoot up like that? The states can't backfill that amount of money. It's just not feasible. So what happens, of course, is benefits are cut. It's incredibly cynical because you will hear Republicans, and New York Republicans in particular, my colleagues, who have nearly as many SNAP beneficiaries as I do, and they will say, oh, well, it's just putting it on the local officials, on the state. But make no mistake, it increases administrative costs, which is just cutting benefits by another name. This program averages $6 per person per day. And the work requirements that we hear so much about would actually cause 300,000 New Yorkers to lose some or all of their SNAP benefits. That is what this bill is doing, and my amendment would fix that. I urge the committee to support it and rule it in order.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Moskowitz. For 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment today would prohibit the executive branch from using federal funds to eliminate FEMA, transfer its responsibilities to another agency, or reduce its staffing or funding in a way that impairs its ability to fulfill its statutory functions unless expressly authorized by Congress. In fact, my amendment today just says again what's in the Stafford Act and what's in the Homeland Security Act, which was passed after Katrina. The president was right that FEMA needs reform. Let me say this again. The president was right that FEMA needs reform, as the chairwoman knows from her experiences in North Carolina after Hurricane Helene. But the Secretary of Homeland Security is dead wrong that FEMA should be deleted. First of all, the Secretary is in violation right now of the Stafford Act and in violation of the Homeland Security Act. The Secretary has no ability to pause all grants, which she has done. She has no ability to transfer any of the appropriations or restructure FEMA as she's done. Both of those are in direct violation of the Stafford Act and the Homeland Security Act that was passed after Katrina. So grants are paused. What does that mean, that all grants are paused? That means states right now that are going into hurricane season don't know whether or not they're going to get a declaration, which this administration is holding back. What happens if you don't get a declaration? Just go ask the governor of Arkansas, Governor Huckabee, who worked for the president. Took her weeks to get a declaration. You can't move, you can't respond, you can't spend money because you don't know that you're going to get reimbursed. Fiscally constrained cities and counties don't make decisions. It's analysis paralysis. It's actually in direct contradiction with what we're trying to do. We're trying to speed up FEMA. We're trying to make it faster, right? Which is why I have a bill with Byron Donalds to get FEMA out of Homeland Security. Homeland is disabusing FEMA. They're using FEMA to do grants for the other 22 agencies. That's why we got to get FEMA away from Homeland Security. They're not paying vendors. You know what happens if we don't pay vendors? They can't pay subcontractors. They're not going to be ready to perform in hurricane season. They fired 30% or got them to retire of the workforce in FEMA. Most of the senior people with that experience. You've got regional offices in FEMA now that are half empty. By the way, remember that DOGE, remember the E at the end of DOGE, the word efficiency? Nothing at FEMA has been made more efficient. In fact, I would tell you that the Secretary of Homeland Security has turned FEMA into the Newark airport, okay? It is going to fail this summer. And so look, there's no doubt that FEMA needed reform, but what they've done at Homeland is they've taken something that needed help and they broke it further. Do you know what happens if there's no FEMA to the state that the Speaker represents or Steve Scalise represents? Louisiana goes bankrupt without FEMA when there's a hurricane that comes in from the Gulf of Mexico or the Gulf of America, comes right into Louisiana, they're bankrupt. Alabama's bankrupt, Mississippi's bankrupt. You get an F5, F4 tornado in Tornado Alley, those states go bankrupt without FEMA. And yet, I don't see my Republican colleagues calling out the administration on how we're going to save FEMA and reform it. Let me say this. I think the Secretary of Homeland Security has exposed the president in significant ways. And I'm not in the business of protecting the president, but I am in the business of protecting the American people and the country. I don't think the president is aware of the current condition of FEMA and its potential inability to perform. We may get lucky, and hopefully we do. Hopefully we don't have a bad hurricane this season. Hopefully we don't have some unforeseen disaster like an earthquake that hasn't happened since the 90s. Lord knows we had a 1 in 100-year pandemic in the first term of the Trump administration. Hopefully we don't have anything like that, because they have decimated FEMA in ways that we won't know until it happens. And listen, I know the chairwoman represents an area that didn't have the best experience after Helene. There's no question about that. There's dramatic improvement that needs to be done at FEMA. But I'm deeply concerned what's happened at Homeland, and I don't think the president is aware the current condition that the secretary has put him and the men and women that work there and the states that are going to go to FEMA and rely on them to help them in their time of need. And those resources are going to come slower. Think about it. You don't get to move your logistics. You don't get to move your water, your ice, your power generation, any of your stuff. And let me remind you, I did this for a living. For a Republican governor, I worked for Ron DeSantis for 2.5 years, took my political hat off. So I'm not giving you partisan coverage. I'm giving you the current state of affairs in an agency that has been absolutely destroyed. And with that, Madam Chairwoman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Moskowitz. Ms. Morrison, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Ranking Member McGovern. My amendment today is simple. Before the House advances the largest Medicaid cut in program history, Congress needs to review how this bill will impact hospitals and Americans' access to services. My amendment simply says that the bill cannot take effect until an independent study confirms that these proposed Medicaid cuts will not result in hospital closures or reductions in service, including obstetric services. The Medicaid policies in this bill will strip health care coverage from millions of Americans and put essential labor and delivery services on the chopping block. Our country is already facing a worsening maternal health crisis and carelessly ripping away women's access to care without any consideration, and it's just plain cruel. We're already dead last in maternal mortality compared to our peer nations, and instead of putting forward a bill that will actually improve women's health and support moms and babies, my Republican colleagues have chosen to gut the program that covers more than 50% of births in many areas of Minnesota. Having cared for women and their babies for over 20 years as an OBGYN, I am appalled by how callously members of this chamber have turned their backs on their constituents. In my home state of Minnesota, 1.4 million Minnesotans get health care coverage through Medicaid, and millions more depend on the hospitals and providers who have been unequivocally clear that the Medicaid cuts in this bill will decimate their ability to provide care. Unequivocally clear that the cuts will force them to reduce services or shut down entirely. And the reality is, if hospitals are unable to keep their lights on and deliver care, we will all pay the price. People will not be able to access care. People will have more medical debt and they will be less healthy. People will suffer. People will die. I would encourage my Republican colleagues to believe the words of the hospitals that serve their constituents, the patients that live in their districts, and analysis after analysis that confirms that these cuts will cost millions of Americans their access to care. So my Republican colleagues who hold majority rule of this chamber, let's be very clear here. You can stop this right now. You can stop the hospital closures. You can stop the cuts to services. You can stop 14 million Americans from losing access to health insurance. You can stop the worsening of the maternal health care crisis and rural hospital crisis. You have the power. You can stop this. More than a dozen of our Republican colleagues here in the House have spoken out and said they cannot support deep cuts to Medicaid. Other Republicans have called these massive cuts morally wrong. And more than a dozen state legislators from my home state of Minnesota wrote our Republican delegation and the president making a very clear case about how this would be a disaster and begged them not to go through with these cuts. I have a copy with me here, Madam Chair, and I request consent for this letter to be entered into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I'd like to highlight just a couple of their points. The Minnesota Republican legislators wrote, and I quote, "Too deep of a cut is unmanageable in any instance. Massive Medicaid reductions could punish Minnesota for being such a strong leader in greater efficiencies and better outcomes. Drastic reductions to Medicaid funding have the potential to impact the 1.4 million people we serve and place incredible pressure on our overall state budget." And they closed with, "Please remind our good leaders in Washington that simply cutting the budget is not going to take away our responsibilities to the aged, those with disabilities, mental health needs, children, and the poor." End quote. So to my Republican colleagues, please hear the pleas of your state counterparts as you consider this bill today. I also have with me here a letter from Minnesota's nonprofit hospitals, and Madam Chair, I would request consent for this letter to be entered into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I'd like to highlight just a couple of their points. They wrote, and I quote, "Any reduction in federal support would trigger immediate consequences. Patients will lose access, hospitals will be forced to reduce services and will face impossible choices. And communities across our state will feel the effects whether they are covered by Medicaid or not. We know these are difficult budget discussions, but cutting Medicaid doesn't erase the need for care. It simply shifts the burden to states, to hospitals, and ultimately to the very people the program is meant to protect." End quote. Their pleas are clear. Their threats are real. The facts are undeniable. So please, on behalf of all Americans, I implore you to do the right thing. Rule this amendment in order and stop these cuts. I yield, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Fishbach, do you have any questions? Mr. McGovern?
Again, I want to thank all of you for your patience and for being here. And you remind all of us of the fact that the underlying bill, the reconciliation bill, is a lousy piece of legislation. I mean, the attacks on health care, attacks on food assistance, the attacks on public lands, the attacks on FEMA, the attacks, on, and the indifference on AI, which is a very dangerous thing that we're about to do. I mean, basically saying we're not going to do our job in the Congress, but we're going to prevent states from doing anything to protect the citizens. I mean, just so many things. I mean, this bill should not be coming to the floor. Your amendments are all good, and we're going to make the case that they should be made in order when we get to the point of actually reporting out a rule. But again, I think it is so important that you stayed here and that you made the case as to how we could improve the bill. Did you have, yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to add something that I know is near and dear to your heart because you're such a leader on food insecurity and it's done such incredible work. These so-called work requirements are such a fig leaf. They're such a pretext when in reality, the census data shows that 82% of households with working age adults who do not live with minor children and did not receive disability benefits had earnings during the year 2023. Right, yeah. This is not an issue that needs to be addressed. It is an issue that is being created so that poor Americans can struggle even more.
Yeah. Again, we had this discussion in the Ag Committee. I mean, of a single mother with a 7-year-old child, you know, who loses her job, and she has 90 days to get another job. Otherwise, she loses her benefit. And the back and forth in the Ag Committee was like, well, you know, he's 7 years old, the child's at school. I mean, like, do people realize what time school gets out? I mean, if people are working, I mean, what happens during the summer? What happens during vacations? I mean, again, many people are able to juggle all this stuff. And the majority of people who are able-bodied, who are on SNAP, actually do work. And there are work requirements, especially for those who are able-bodied adults without dependents. But to be totally indifferent to what life is like for a single parent with a 7 or 8 or 9-year-old child, and to just say, oh, one glove fits all, it's just a cruel and rotten thing to do. And we're talking about food assistance and a really, you know, meager food benefit, on average $2 per person per meal. You know, and by the way, with the state cost share, that requirement now, many states won't be able to meet that cost share, and so that $2 benefit will get even less. I mean, you can't buy a cup of coffee in the Capitol for $2. And it's like this is where you're going to try to get money to offset tax cuts for billionaires? Like, who does this? I mean, like, who thought this brilliant idea up? I mean, it's just such a terrible thing to do. I mean, there are other things we could do to improve programs. Every program can be improved. But this is not it. And I appreciate your amendment. I appreciate all your amendments and look forward to working with you. I yield back.
Thank you. I just, again, wanted to, we'll just wave at this point. I want to thank you all for your amendments and for sticking around so long. Representative Lofgren, I really appreciated your bringing attention to the fact that when cuts are made to scientific research, medical research, it doesn't just harm that research. And of course, we've heard about, you know, ovarian cancer trials being paused, people not being able to get treatment that they were hoping would impact their issues. But we then know there's job loss when that happens. We're hearing from universities in my district that students who thought they had internships, which would make them the researchers of tomorrow, are losing those internships. And then we're hearing from contractors and tradespeople that universities, in order to try to preserve some of the research, are diverting funding from capital projects. And then we have contractors losing those jobs and tradespeople being laid off because those things are happening. And Rep. Houlihan, you know, we have so many veterans in southeastern Pennsylvania. I think you and I, we each have about 27,000, 28,000 veterans in our districts. You've got the Coatesville facility in your district. The Philadelphia VA is adjacent to my district. And of course, we've just tried to expand the benefits available to our veterans through the PACT Act. And at the same time that we're trying to expand those benefits and make sure that people actually get the treatment that they are entitled to, that they've earned through their service, we're seeing these funding cuts and the pulling back. So thank you for amendments bringing attention to all of that and everything that people have put forward. Excuse me, losing my voice. I yield back.
Could I just address the science issue briefly? Because we've seen reductions in physics, in mathematics, in chemistry, in computer science, And what we've seen all across the United States is universities reducing the number of doctoral students that they are admitting because they cannot see how to pay for the research. So what's happening? Europe, Canada, and yes, China are recruiting the scientists that we are losing. So we are going to pay a big economic price for a long time for what's already happened. So let's stop the digging and try and recover, because this is going to hit our economy in a way that is really terrible, terrible impact. I thank you for.
Well, and you do bring up another point, which is that these foreign students coming to the U.S., when we are making them feel unwelcome, they often pay full freight.
Correct.
Which is really, really helpful to our universities, and all of a sudden, that's an income source that
Well,
they
the
don't
number
have.
of F1 student applications has completely crashed.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, we're losing money because they subsidize the American students. And then we're also losing, you know, almost 50% of the Nobel Prize winners who are Americans in the sciences were Americans by choice, Americans born someplace else. Those people are not going to be here in our future.
So it's a talent drain and a financial drain. Thank you. I yield back.
Thanks, Ms. Scanlon. Do my colleagues on my side have any questions? Okay. Well, thank you all very much. Seeing no one else having questions, the panel is excused. Thank you very much for coming. If the next panel we could do, I hope you did this, start down here and move up. Ms. Ansari, Ms. Johnson, Ms. Hayes, Mr. Kassar, Ms. Williams, Mr. Cisneros, Mr. Kurson, and Mr. Takano. Doesn't really matter which seat you sit in. I'll call you by the way you were on this list. Yeah, Markham. No, Ms. Hayes. No, Kassar. Cisneros. Ms. Ansari, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Fox and Ranking Member McGovern, for allowing me the opportunity to join today's hearing. First, let me start by saying that the fact that we have been here since the literal middle of the night at a committee markup that will determine the federal government's budget, something that affects every single American, is absurd. But I'm proud of the showing of Democrats in this room, of colleagues who have been here for decades, alongside some colleagues who, like me, have been here for just a couple of months. We hail from different parts of the country, different backgrounds, different ideas on policy, but we stand united against this bill and the process by which it is moving through this committee. I urge you to support my amendment that would strike the text of the bill and replace it with the Stock Act 2.0. This would prevent government officials and their immediate family members from being able to trade individual stocks. The original Stock Act barred members of Congress, the President, Vice President, and high-level staff from engaging in insider trading or otherwise using non-public information for their own benefit. It also included important updates to financial transparency by requiring these high-ranking government officials to disclose financial transactions to the public. It is because of this latter provision that we discovered earlier this month that the chairman of the committee with jurisdiction over oil and gas, as well as mining lease sales, bought up to $150,000 in stock throughout the month of March. Those stocks included shares of oil companies like ExxonMobil, Chevron, BP, ConocoPhillips, Suncor, and Canadian Natural Resources. They also included mining companies like BHP, Freeport-McMoRan, and Rio Tinto, for whom the largest shareholder is a Chinese state-owned corporation. These oil and mining stock trades took place while the chairman was writing a major portion of this very bill, the portion that is an unprecedented multi-billion-dollar giveaway to oil and mining companies. Now, so many of these CEOs are set to directly benefit from this partisan budget that makes draconian cuts to the programs on which my constituents and my Republican colleagues' constituents rely on. This is bigger than any one member benefiting from a stock trade. It's about this legislation as a whole, a budget that endorses this kind of behavior, uplifts it, and makes it into real policy that benefits the ultra-rich getting richer over everything else. Let's be clear, this so-called big, beautiful bill is not in the interest of the American people. It includes billions of dollars in cuts from critical programs such as SNAP and Medicaid. Over 7.6 million Americans would lose their health insurance just from these cuts. And that doesn't include the millions of Americans that would lose access to health care when hospitals that rely on Medicaid are forced to shut down, all while giving trillions of dollars in handouts to mega corporations and the ultra-wealthy. And now we also know that at least one member of Congress could personally and directly enrich himself from these provisions. This is corruption, plain and simple. My amendment would strike the text of this bill and replace it with legislation that would prevent this sort of corruption from public officials. This is not a partisan issue, it is common sense. Members of Congress should not be able to use their positions of power for personal financial gain, nor should there be a perception of such. We should not have to rely on the self-restraint of members of Congress to resist the temptation of self-dealing and insider trading. It just should not be allowed. Even Speaker Mike Johnson voiced his support for banning stock trading for members of Congress last week, stating that members of Congress should not, quote, have any appearance of impropriety, end quote. The oil and mining stock trade that happened while the chair was writing this bill to give away unprecedented sums to oil and mining industries most certainly has the appearance of impropriety. I sincerely hope that it is just an appearance. At a time when public trust in Congress is abysmal, we have to work harder to rebuild it. Banning stock trades by members of Congress is the first step. It's the lowest hanging fruit. There is absolutely no reason why Republicans on this committee should oppose this amendment. I urge the committee to make my amendments in order. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Madam Chairman, Ranking Member McGovern. There's so much to talk about in this bill, and I have several amendments, and I want to highlight two of them. But before I do that, I wanted to make some general comments on behalf of the residents of Texas 32 and the great state of Texas. Our deficit is at catastrophic levels. We've had multiple committee hearings in this building that suggest we're going to be facing some very impending financial crisis. Our federal credit rating was just reduced. And this bill and the Republicans in this building are voting to add $4 trillion to the deficit in the most irresponsible way possible, on the backs of hungry children, on the backs of young mothers and families and the poor in this country to keep them from getting health care, on the backs of children and kids who want to get an education in cybersecurity, on the backs of safety of our aviation and our airports, on the backs of FEMA and states for disaster preparedness, on the backs of law enforcement officers who are being routinely terminated, on the backs of woeful areas across this government for lack of prudent and proper investment to the health and safety and the prosperity of this country. And we're being put in a dire financial strait so that the President of the United States can reward a few of his friends with extra money in their bank account that they don't need, that they can't spend. And the Republicans in this Congress have abdicated all the values that they have campaigned on for decades in homage to this one man. And it is a travesty to this government and to the American people that this is happening. Democrats have been protesting this viciously all through the day in the weeks preceding this to have the American people wake up and say, this is harming you. This bill will hurt the American people. I have an amendment for the Affordable Care Act tax credit. Millions of people get their health care in this country because of the Affordable Care Act. Texas is one of the leading states of it. Our state and our health care system is going to be devastated. And this is a bill that is supposed to give tax cuts, but yet we are removing one of the most critical tax cuts that the American people rely on. It makes absolutely no sense. How can we tout the greatest tax cut bill to the American people at the same time we are cutting one of the most important tax cuts that benefits the vast majority of the American people? And I really would like to urge this committee to restore the tax cuts of the Affordable Care Act. Millions and millions of people in the state of Texas and across this land desperately rely on that to get the desperate needs of healthcare. Small businesses, our new entrepreneurs, the young people who don't work for big corporations with vast amounts of employees to have diversity of risk. They rely on the Affordable Care Act. And health insurance is already one of the leading expenses of a family in this country, and it is prohibitively expensive. And this initiative, the Affordable Care Act, and these tax credits make it possible. The other amendment I would like to address for this committee is to restore funding to FEMA. I sit on the Homeland Security Committee. I've heard so much testimony about the urgent need and the critical role that FEMA plays as the backstop for states and American families when nature and the disasters strike out of the blue without ability to prepare. It's the safety net that is so critically relied on by so many. Our country will be at an peril on our national security, on our preparedness, if we don't have FEMA to come in and put the pieces back together. To just today, horrible tornadoes ripped through Alabama. I mean, no state is free from natural disaster, and Texas is certainly one of the states that has had to rely on FEMA the most. Hurricane Harvey decimated our Gulf Coast. Tornadoes decimate North Texas. We're the 6th largest economy in the world, the state of Texas. And without FEMA, we will be so burdened in putting our country back together that the federal government will also be harmed. I appreciate the consideration for this committee, and I strongly encourage you to adopt my amendments and make them in order. And with that, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. Ms. Hayes, you're recognized.
Thank you. Hungry kids don't learn. This issue has always been important to me. Unless and until you've come into your classroom on a Monday morning and seen a kid with their head down, knowing that they haven't had a decent meal since they left, you can't understand. Unless and until you find yourself automatically packing a second piece of fruit in your lunch because you expect that one of your students is going to ask you for it, you can't understand. It changes you. It does something to you. When I came to Congress, I knew I would work to help address food insecurity. But my Republican colleagues here in this bill seek to exacerbate it. Hunger is a policy choice, and today we're considering legislation that makes the choice to take food away from people, from children. The reconciliation bill we are considering here today is the largest ever cut to the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. Approximately $313 billion will be taken away from the most vulnerable in our country: hungry children, families, veterans, and seniors. Republicans are pushing a legislative package that guts SNAP, the most efficient and effective anti-poverty program in this nation. The cost-sharing provisions in this legislation are going to shift the financial burden to states, forcing the states to cut benefits, eligibility, or both in order to reduce costs. States have always been responsible for hiring staff and administering the benefits they receive through the federal government and paying an equal share with the federal government. Under this bill, a workforce already facing shortages would have more responsibility to address paperwork errors with fewer funds. This bill does nothing to support workforce development or the administrative support that will come as a result of these changes. In my state of Connecticut, the Department of Social Services estimates that this would cost an additional $177 million per year. But based on the FY23 error rates, the state of New York, which would be forced to pay $1.8 billion, Texas, $1.074 billion, Georgia, $82 million, and North Carolina, $584 million in additional costs to administer these programs. Additionally, this legislation would prevent the Secretary of Agriculture from reevaluating the Thrifty Food Plan, which is used to determine benefit eligibility amounts. This bill also expands work requirements for older adults up to age 65 and for parents in households with children age 7 or older, which means that 4 million children between the ages of 7 and 17 who live in households that receive SNAP would be at risk of losing some type of food assistance. While expanding these requirements, this legislation does nothing, once again, to fund workforce development programs or increase access to child care for these families. I would also note that when children lose their SNAP benefits, they automatically lose their CEP, which is the community eligibility provision that allows them to get free and reduced lunch at school. So not only is food being taken away from children at home, it is being taken away from them at school. My amendment is simple. It prevents any cuts to SNAP that would reduce benefits for the 42 million Americans who rely on the program for food assistance. My amendment says that this legislation can only take effect once the USDA and all state agencies issue reports evaluating and certifying that any changes made to SNAP would not result in a reduction of benefits to eligible individuals or decrease in population. SNAP serves 16 million children, 8 million seniors, and 4 million people with disabilities. I've heard over and over and over that the target is able-bodied adults without dependents who have the ability to work. If that is true, and that is the only group you are targeting, then it should be simple to make sure that we are protecting children and families and seniors and those with disabilities from being cut off of these programs. I can't understand why my Republican colleagues would not vote for that. Based on your testimony and everything that you've said in regards to SNAP, these aren't the people you're going after anyway. So we should all work together to ensure that we protect them. I've heard members from the other side of the aisle say that their intention is not to cut benefits. This amendment is your chance to go on the record and do just that. While I question the intent here and where we are going, I understand with fidelity the outcome and who will be affected. In the wealthiest nation in the world, we have the ability to feed children. We don't have a drought, we don't have a famine, we don't have a war. We have policies that intend to take food out of the mouths of children. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Thank you, Ms. Hayes. Mr. Kassar, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon. So in this terrible Republican budget bill, we're talking about saving money by cutting waste, fraud, and abuse. But then when we actually look at the bill about who's taking a cut, well, of course, we are cutting taxes for billionaires, but the people who are taking a cut is a person with a disability who will lose their health care because we say, well, you've got a disability, but it's not quite bad enough, or you didn't fill out this piece of paper. Or we're cutting the $6 a day in food assistance to a child because now you're 8 years old, not 7 years old, so you don't need it anymore. You kidding me? When folks think about waste, fraud, and abuse, we aren't talking about these Americans. If you want to see waste, tens of billions of dollars get milked by big pharma every year off of the taxpayer in the Medicare Advantage program. We could be getting tens of billions of dollars from them. Or if you want to talk about fraud, we could be talking about the billionaires who hide their money in offshore accounts that we should be going after. Or if you want to talk about abuse, this bill that's supposed to be saving money has $25 billion in it for Trump's Golden Dome project. That recently was reported, the person most likely to get that money is Elon Musk. So while he's in the White House playing with the president, this bill is sending potentially $25 billion to Elon Musk. When we talk about waste, fraud, and abuse, we should be looking at those folks with lots of power who are milking the taxpayers, not the biggest Medicare cut in American history or the biggest Medicaid cut in American history. So come on, y'all. So one of the amendments I've proposed is pretty simple. Let's say if a federal court finds that Elon Musk abused his power to be able to route money to himself, then we could save ourselves billions of dollars by automatically canceling out these billionaire tax cuts and the billions of dollars in contracts that Elon Musk has. If nobody on this panel thinks that Elon Musk hasn't been abusing his power, then we could just put this amendment in order and take it to a vote. If Elon Musk is found to have abused his power, we can save ourselves a whole bunch of money. And as if that isn't enough of the heart of the hypocrisy here, the Republican Party that campaigned on saving people money, one, is talking about saving billionaires money with their tax cut, and two, in this bill, they're going to jack up the premiums on health care for the people that rely on the marketplace for their health care. And so I will hand the mic over, yield my time to any of my Republican colleagues that want to address the amount of money that their tax-paying citizens are going to have to pay in increased premiums for their health care. If anybody wants to mention, we have the numbers, everybody here has the numbers, how much your constituents are going to have to pay more every year in health care because of this bill. I don't know the numbers for my district. It's going to be a 50% increase, over $400 in my district. And that's actually not even close to how much in many of the Republican districts there's going to be an increase. I would yield the mic.
I think we're 78% in my district.
78% in Mr. McGovern's district. Maybe none of the Republican members want to mention it, but the Republican gentleman from New York, there would be a 44% increase, $2,000 a year hit to his constituents in their health care costs. The distinguished gentleman from Virginia, his constituents would face an increase in $770 a year in their health care premiums. The distinguished Republican chairwoman of this committee, a 60% increase in health care premiums, and that's on average. The distinguished Republican congresswoman here from Minnesota was recently told here by the committee on the budget that a 60-year-old couple with a joint income of $85,000 a year in her district would see an $11,000 a year increase in their costs while we're giving tax cuts to billionaires. And what bothers me the most is that we want to hide it. Nobody wants here to talk about the fact that they're jacking up insurance costs on their own constituents while giving a billionaire a tax break. Nobody on the Republican side pushing this bill wants to have an in-person town hall and look their constituents in the face and explain to them why they want to hand Elon Musk another $25 billion contract while jacking up your health insurance costs, not just by hundreds, but by thousands of dollars. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Kassar. Ms. Williams, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Fox, Ranking Member McGovern. Y'all, this meeting started at 1 a.m. and has been going through the entire night, morning, and now day. We're considering one of the most harmful bills to ever come before the House, cutting health care from 14 million Americans, taking food from the mouths of hungry children, seniors, and veterans. My Republican colleagues were hoping that my Democratic colleagues and I would sleep through the night as the American people slept. But what's done in the dark, y'all, comes to the light, and I'm here to shed the light. That's why I stayed up all night, and that's why I'm here right now as the voice of Georgia's fighting 5th Congressional District. I follow in the footsteps of the late Congressman John Lewis, known as the conscience of the Congress. And if there's anything Republicans need more of these days, it's a conscience. Because who with a conscience would rip health care away from 14 million people in this country? Who with a conscience would make the largest cut in history to food benefits for children, seniors, veterans, and people with disabilities? Who with a conscience would add $5 trillion to the deficit with nothing to show for it but billionaire tax cuts? No one with a conscience would do any of that, but that's exactly what this Republican so-called one big beautiful bill would do. Congressman John Lewis would be ashamed of y'all. I know that I am. But you know what? He'd be proud of his Democratic colleagues for making the good trouble by unleashing that on behalf of the American people. House Democrats wrote 537 amendments to your so-called One Big Beautiful Bill. Just because Republicans aren't willing to change their bill to actually help the American people, it definitely won't stop us from offering these amendments because we know that it doesn't have to be this way. I have 16 amendments myself. One, to invest in programs to increase our housing supply and lower housing costs. Another, to stop taxpayer funding for anti-abortion clinics that spread disinformation about women's health care. Another, to stop Trump from cutting essential federal workers without at least getting a report from Congress on how it'll harm government services. Another, to stop Trump from profiting off funding for presidential security. An additional one, to increase nutrition benefits and eligibility for students. Another, to require reports on how the policies in this bill affect low-income individuals and racial inequities. Another, to stop January 6th insurrectionists from getting a settlement from the federal government for their crimes. And yet another, to ensure that members of Congress can continue conducting lawful oversight in ICE facilities. Another one, to make maternal medical care, menstrual products, and broadband costs covered expenses for determining people's eligibility for food assistance. Another, to stop Elon Musk from selling the federal government AI systems while he's employed by our federal government. And yet another, to stop any funds in this bill from being used to unconstitutionally remove a United States citizen from this country. Another, to require the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau to remain independent of whoever is president, Democratic or Republican. And yet another, to keep the funding for sustainable aviation fuel, which supports our aviation industry to be cleaner and more environmentally friendly. If my Republican colleagues really want to do right by the American people, you'd approve all of these amendments. I can't fix everything in this horrible bill, even with the 16 amendments that I'm offering, but these would definitely be a start. And next time, maybe open up this big, beautiful bill to some big, beautiful debate in the light of day. Because it doesn't matter what your ideas are if you can't defend them in broad daylight for the American people. You must be hiding something from the American people. The children, seniors, and veterans in my district that will lose health care and SNAP benefits, y'all, they are more than a line item in a budget. They are real people simply trying to survive. So don't turn your back on them to give tax cuts to billionaires. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Williams. Mr. Cisneros, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Fox, Ranking Member McGovern, and members of the Rules Committee. I am deeply disappointed with how this hearing came about. The majority scheduled a hearing in the middle of the night to further their agenda without debate or scrutiny. But the timing of the hearing cannot hide the fact this legislation rips off the American people. It increases tax breaks for the wealthiest Americans, paid for by nearly $700 billion in cuts to Medicaid and $267 billion cuts to SNAP. I'm here to offer 4 amendments to this flawed legislation and urge the committee to make them in order. My first amendment seeks to ensure Congress is authorizing the funds needed to pay our child care workers and maintain our modernized and the facilities where they work in the Department of Defense. My amendment would increase child care fee assistance to $200 million, add $1.3 billion for Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, and Space Force Child Development Center facility maintenance, and include $1 billion for child care provider compensation under the Department of Defense's modernization of the Child Development Program staffing model passed in the fiscal year 25 NDAA. I want to be clear, my amendment does not raise the top line. Instead, it will take from an expensive and unnecessary program and instead support our service members' family needs. My next amendment seeks to reassert congressional oversight into the activities of the Department of Defense. My amendment allows the department to access the first $100 billion of the bill's funding, but before the department can use the last $50 billion, it simply requires the department to answer some elementary oversight questions about DOGE and the Department of Defense. I support better efficiency in program management at the Pentagon, as I know many of my colleagues do. I've been proud to support numerous efforts to that effect, and I look forward to working with my colleagues in a bipartisan way in the future, but that's not what this bill is. Our responsibility is to conduct oversight, and so far, our questions to the department have yielded insubstantial or non-existent answers, and the administration seems unable to explain the role of DOGE in the Department of Defense. I know the DoD is capable of giving thoughtful responses. I have sat in the witness seat before and have answered questions, and I've been required to reply to congressional inquiries, which I gladly did because that was my responsibility. At the very least, we should understand what this unauthorized department is doing to one of the departments that we are supposed to be overseeing in Congress. My third amendment seeks to expand eligibility for the employer provide child care tax credit. This amendment would define small business concern in accordance with the Small Business Act for the purpose of the employer-provided child care tax credit. This would help small businesses attract and retain employees that are working parents. My final amendment seeks to revise the short title of the bill to the One Big Billionaire Bailout Act. Raising a child, owning a small business, having access to affordable and quality health care in this economy, it's becoming more difficult with the rising cost of living. Again, this bill, instead of helping hardworking Americans nationwide, gives a government handout to billionaires and the wealthiest Americans at the expense of everyone else. The name matters because it tells the truth of what this fine print hides. I am happy to tell the American people who this bill really serves, because it is not them. Again, I urge you to make these amendments in order. Thank you, and I'm happy to take any of your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Cisneros. Mr. Chicano, I'll go to you next.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. Let's begin with the obvious. This bill, the so-called budget reconciliation package, is not even finished. Republican leadership is asking members to vote on a moving target with text still changing and details still unclear. Even Republican members don't know what's in it, but they're being told to rush this to the floor before the holiday weekend so they can hand Donald Trump a political win. Trump has made his demand clear. Unite behind what is possibly the most budget-busting piece of legislation in modern U.S. history. And now, Republicans are stuck between their talking point of deficit reduction and their obligation to do whatever Donald Trump tells them to do. Last night, the Congressional Budget Office released its score. It found that this bill would increase the deficit by $2.3 trillion over the next decade. Let me say that again, $2.3 trillion. That would trigger automatic cuts to Medicare and other vital programs unless Congress steps in. And who benefits? According to the CBO, the richest 10% of Americans would see their incomes go up, while the poorest 10% would see theirs go down. So yes, this bill deserves a name, and I would call it One Big Billionaire Payout. And while billionaires and corporations are poised to win big, the people I serve, veterans, students, and working families are set to lose. I'm offering 10 amendments to stop the worst of this damage. First, I've introduced an amendment to exempt disabled veterans from new Medicaid work requirements. Now, not all veterans are eligible to receive their health care from VA, and currently 1.6 million veterans rely on Medicaid. This bill would subject as many as 1 million of them to bureaucratic red tape just to keep their health care. Many veterans with service-connected disabilities fall below the disability rating that makes them eligible for VA care and significant barriers to employment. Punishing them for that is not reform, it's cruelty. Now, second, if you're going to rip away veterans' health care, the least you can do is tell them. My amendment would require CMS to notify veterans who are losing Medicaid coverage. Third, I've offered a similar amendment requiring USDA to notify veterans and service members if they're kicked off SNAP. Over 1 million veterans rely on food assistance, and this bill, again, takes from those who served and gives to those who stockpile wealth without sacrifice. Fourth and fifth, I propose creating websites through HHS and USDA to help veterans navigate the fallout, healthcare and nutrition resources for those losing coverage. It's a modest effort to clean up the mess this bill creates. Sixth, I'm offering an amendment to preserve nursing home staffing reforms. In 2024, CMS finalized a rule to address dangerous understaffing. This bill delays that and could cost lives. University of Pennsylvania research estimates 13,000 lives would be saved annually under that rule. Who exactly are we protecting by delaying that? Certainly not the seniors living in those homes. My seventh amendment strikes the repeal of the 2023 Borrower Defense Rule, a protection for student borrowers defrauded by predatory colleges. In just 1 year, over 770,000 students filed claims. This bill would make it nearly impossible for future victims to get relief. Eighth, I strike the repeal of the 90-10 rule fix, a bipartisan protection that keeps for-profit colleges from targeting veterans as dollar signs. Without it, GI Bill recipients become cash cows for worthless diploma mills, and taxpayers foot the bill when these shady schools collapse. Ninth, I proposed a certify no harm amendment which would simply require federal agencies to confirm that these provisions won't increase fraud against student veterans before they take effect. If Republicans are so confident this bill won't hurt anyone, this should be an easy yes. And finally, my 10th amendment includes the Protect Students Act, codifying essential safeguards against deceptive marketing, inflated job placement claims, and outright fraud by for-profit colleges and loan servicers. And let me close by reminding my colleagues that this isn't some routine budget bill. This is reverse Robin Hood. It steals health care from veterans, it steals food from hungry families, it steals loan protections from students, and it steals safety from nursing home residents. And it does all that to give billionaires a payday with a price tag of $2.3 trillion in new debt. This isn't about values, it's about vanity, trying to give a twice-impeached former president a talking point for his next rally. I urge my colleagues to support these amendments and reject this sham of a bill. And I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Takano. Mr. Carson.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you, Ranking Member. Thank you for providing me the time to testify this afternoon. I have 4 amendments to this reconciliation bill. My amendments protect Medicaid, passenger rail, our environment, and would protect the middle class. I first want to speak on Amendment 428 to conduct a comprehensive audit within 180 days to assess the impact of this bill's impact on income inequality in our country. The GOP claims their tax policies will benefit the middle class. I say prove it. Prove to the American people that the tax policies in this bill will help the middle class, not the ultra-wealthy. Next, my Amendment 168 addresses one of the most urgent, life-threatening issues in this bill, which is that this bill would slash health care for 14 million Americans. Just this afternoon, an Indianapolis woman named Joan contacted our office. She is about to turn 65, she's disabled, and she receives Medicaid to survive. She told me, at 65 years old, I have nowhere else to go, and I don't want to lose my home, and I don't want to lose my health care. Yesterday evening, I spoke on the House floor about 3 women from my district in Indy, Erica, Bethany, and Carol Ann, who rely on SNAP and Medicaid to survive. These are just 3 of the thousands of people who have reached out to us in the past few weeks. We receive messages from folks every day who are afraid for themselves, but they're also terrified for their children, other people's children, their family members, other people's family members. That's because Indianapolis is a community that cares about one another. We look out for one another. It's what we do. It's who we are. I've always been proud of my hometown, but I'm even more proud of hearing the groundswell of support, especially over the last week, from those in Indianapolis who have overwhelmingly told me we must help our neighbors and we must protect Medicaid. I'm here today to fight for the people of Indianapolis who deserve a government that stands with them, not billionaires. This past week, our country has watched members of Congress debate essentially who deserves to live and who deserves to die in our country. For 14 million Americans, health care and Medicaid cuts aren't a political discussion. They are a matter of life and death. 14 million Americans would lose health care under this current bill. That includes newborns, children, seniors, and postpartum mothers, the most vulnerable among us. We've also watched Republican members of Congress deny that this bill will slash Medicaid, even though a nonpartisan analysis found that the Republican budget simply would not be possible without cutting Medicaid and essential health care. And yet, many of my colleagues still deny that this budget will drastically cut essential health care. So, my message to my colleagues is, prove it. If you insist your bill will not hurt Medicaid, if you insist this bill will not snatch health care out of the hands of 14 million men, women, and children, prove it by simply passing my amendment. My amendment would ensure none of the provisions of this bill will take effect if there is an increase in mortality rates due to reduced access to health care services as a result of this bill. If Republicans truly believe this bill is not taking money away from Medicaid to give tax breaks to billionaires, then they should have no problem passing this amendment. If Republicans believe that at a minimum, we should make sure this bill does not cause Americans to die, then they shouldn't have a problem passing my amendment. I would like to close my remarks, Madam Chair and Ranking Member, by reminding us again of Joan, Erica, Bethany, and Carol Ann in the great Hoosier State. I implore you to remember their humanity. 14 million people who stand to lose their health care are relying on us to do the right thing. Protect Medicaid, protect health care, protect our children. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Carson. Does anyone on my side wish to ask any questions? Mr. Scott, Mr. Griffith? Okay. Mr. McGovern, you're recognized.
Yeah, no, again, I want to thank everybody here for being in the fight. There's too much at stake. I mean, you highlighted many of the concerns that have been echoed over and over again today. Thank you. I mean, Johanna Hayes and I were on the Ag Committee when they marked up the Ag section of this reconciliation bill, and it was maddening. And not just because of the impact of the cuts on children, on vulnerable people, on senior citizens, on veterans, on people with disabilities, but this kind of indifference, like it's no big deal. And it is a big deal. It is a big deal. If you can't put food on the table for your kids, that's a huge deal. That's every parent's worst nightmare. You know, if you're a senior citizen, not being able to afford your medication and your food, that's a big deal. And you know, a lot of the issues that were raised by this panel, you know, point to the fact that it seems that the people who are going to suffer the most are the most vulnerable, and the people who are well off and well connected and have the most are going to get even more. And so, again, I thank you for staying. Some of you have been here like since 1 o'clock in the morning. I've seen you in the hallways at 2 o'clock in the morning, and you know, and so you've been around. And but I really do think it's important that people speak up. And Ms. Hayes.
I just want to say that, thank you for that, but as many of you know, I spent my career as a classroom teacher, and when you're on the other side of these processes and you're in a building with children and not really understanding how these policy decisions are being made, everything from protecting them from gun violence to mental health and wraparound services to something as basic as food. You know, understanding that federal law prohibited the lunch lady from even giving students a sandwich at the end of the day, and instead she had to throw it away. It is heartbreaking. So then to get here and be faced with the realization that there are people who understand what these policies do and still support them. These are not oversights. These are not loopholes. These are policy choices and intentional decisions that are being made. Right now, we are debating legislation once again. I mean, I saw it in the debt ceiling negotiations, in the CR, in every budget every year, and now in reconciliation, where we move from hypotheticals to reduce food benefits that directly impact children. And it's something that I will never understand for as long as I am in this body. I will also never stop fighting for those kids, because I understand that they deserve a chance. And in the same breath where we are talking about subsidies and tax cuts and corporations and tax breaks and even deductions, something as basic as food should just not be an issue. And the idea of, I've heard many people just keep throwing out waste and fraud and abuse. If that was truly the concern, we would be supporting SNAP administrators and making sure that we had highly qualified staff to process these applications. If that was truly the concern, we would be investing in workforce development to put people back to work. Because I can tell you, no one wants to be poor. And $6 per person per day is not a come up.
And if we're really interested in fraud, waste, and abuse, I don't know why we don't look at the Department of Defense, which can't seem to pass an audit, but that we're giving
No,
them-
we've increased their
Yeah,
budget.
we're increasing their budget. But this is a fight worth having, and I'm glad you're all in the fight. With that, I yield back.
McGovern, Ms. Scanlon.
Yeah, I appreciate Mr. Carson's amendment, which really tries to get at what the underlying principles are in this bill, and is this tax policy really going to help people? And as we've been locked in our little room here for the last however long, 2 hours ago, I've got an article from CNBC. Dow slides more than 800 points as spiking Treasury yields and deficit fears spur a sell-off. And there's multiple articles out there now talking about the fact that this bill moving through with its deficit increases, although they're being used to justify all these cuts to essential services, but the fact that this is going to explode the deficit is causing another stock market dip and causing Treasury bonds, something I never thought I'd spend a lot of time talking about, to spike. You know, it's just, it undercuts the whole argument for this bill. So thank you for thinking about that. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Scanlon. Mr. Goose. Thank you. Ms. Leisure Fernandez.
Thank you, and thank you very much. I mean, I think a lot of what we have been talking about today is what is fair, right? What is right for the American people, how we build back trust up, and how what we're seeing in this bill is this big transfer, this favoritism to the wealthy, this prioritizing them over the hungry kids in the classroom, over the families who need that assistance with the health care premiums, the Affordable Care Act. Americans love the Affordable Care Act, right? And one of the ways, Representative Ansari, when you suggest we do the Stock Act, you're essentially saying, let's put trust back in the system. Is that right? I mean, what is the impetus for that?
Yeah, I mean, we know that about 87% of Americans, both Democrats, independents, and Republicans, believe that members of Congress should not be trading stocks. And when I discovered during the natural resources markup that the chairman of that committee, for the first time in the 10 years that he's been in Congress, decided to suddenly trade hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of oil and gas stocks, I was genuinely shell-shocked.
But it was the concept was let's put trust back in the system. And I see we have one of the sponsors who might be joining us on one of our panels. But I think that that's this concept of who is benefiting and how do we actually say this is what government can do and this is how we put trust back in the system is really playing throughout all of the testimony, whether it's from veterans, healthcare, hunger, or just let's make sure that Americans trust us. And so thank you for taking the time to make sure that Americans know what we're doing here. Because I can tell you, well, that's going, well, the stock market is terrified of what they are doing here. Americans are watching what we are doing here, and they are so appreciative. And I know we're all getting lots of calls and texts and outreach because they're watching. They are watching, and the senators are watching. I went to go get some food, and the senators are watching what we're doing in rules. Who knew? So thank you, Representative
Can I just say,
Ranking Member
Fernandez,
Takano.
that we could save money if we did not repeal the 90-10 rule, $1.6 billion. It's going to cost us to put veterans more at risk to be preyed upon by for-profit colleges. And I would say to my friend Johanna Hayes, I'd like to put that $1.6 billion that we would save if we did not repeal 90-10, that would protect our veterans, to put it toward feeding those kids in your classroom.
Yeah, that's what all this is about, was who do we prioritize, right? Let's feed the kids. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Ledger-Fernandez. There being no further questions, the panel is dismissed. Let me announce the next panel, and if you all could go down to the end again, Mr. Ruiz, Dr. Adams, Ms. Matsui, Ms. Brown, Mr. Liccardo, Mr. Correa, Ms. Sanchez, Mr. Menendez. One more, yeah, there you go. I did.
No. What was it?
Ms. Liccardo.
Liccardo.
Liccardo. Mr. Liccardo, pardon me. It doesn't matter. I'll call you this, it's okay. You can sit either place. Thank you, Dr. Adams. I'll call you number 2, even if you're the 3rd chair. Ms. Matsui just moved a little faster. Well, thank you all very much for being here this afternoon. And I will start with Mr. Ruiz. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you, Ranking Member, for letting us offer amendments to this big, ugly bill. We all know that taking health insurance away from 13.7 million people, 12.4 million U.S. citizens is going to cause an increase in those that are uninsured. And we all know that when they get sick, their only place for care is going to be in the emergency departments, because our EMTALA laws mandate that emergency care physicians like myself will need to take care of patients if their life, sight, or limbs are threatened. And that uncompensated care is going to increase costs, and it's going to affect everybody, whether or not you have Medicaid or private insurance. So my amendment would require states to produce an assessment of the effects of the coverage losses from this Medicaid title on rates of uncompensated care and emergency department wait times for each hospital that receives a disproportionate share hospital payments. We know that the increase in the population that goes into the hospitals that are uncompensated, that goes into the emergency department, will result in longer wait times to see a physician. There will be increase in overcrowdedness in the hospitals. The hospitals would bear a larger burden of those costs, And hospitals will do several things to make up for that. One is they will increase their own costs, and two, they will fire healthcare providers, and three, the other thing they will do is they will start to eliminate the services that don't bring a lot of revenue into the hospital. And those services usually are pediatrics and they're labor and delivery. So children will be affected, maternity care, women, pregnant ladies who are also covered in Medicaid will be affected because those services won't exist in the hospital. And the final thing that they would do, and there's evidence from this, the Inland Empire Health Plan that manages 90% of Medicaid patients in Riverside County and San Bernardino County in California, recently sent me a letter saying that co-signed by 8 hospital CEOs, saying that if there are significant Medicaid cuts, they would be forced to close. So think about this. If you're having an emergency, a stroke, or cardiac ischemia, or heart attack, and that hospital is no longer in your community, where are you going to go for emergency care? And this is those that are on private health insurance too. This is how cutting Medicaid is going to affect everybody. The second amendment that I co-introduced with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez will go after fraud and reinvest in Medicaid Advantage by going after the overcoding problem that exists and take those monies that are saved and reinvest in Medicare. And the reason why we want to invest in Medicare is to help provide the resources for providers to actually pay for the cost of care. You see, providers have not had their reimbursements from Medicare commensurate increase with the cost of providing care, and therefore, since 2001 to about 2023, there's been a 26% cut in the reimbursements for providers. If this continues, providers are going to take less Medicare patients in order to make sure they're able to pay their bills. And so I know that this bill has a quasi-small, pitiful, so-called doc fix, where it's only 75% of the Medicare Economic Index or the inflation rate, and then a few years after that, 10% each year. I want to insert my piece of legislation as through this amendment that would provide the full doc fix, which would tie the Medicare physician reimbursement to 100% of the Medicare Economic Index. Doing so will help protect Medicare for providers and seniors and strengthen the program so that more seniors can have access to that. So if you're really about cutting fraud or cutting waste, and you're really about increasing access, then you would be allowing this amendment to be germane and included into the overall big, ugly bill. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Ruiz. Dr. Adams, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the ranking member for the opportunity to speak this evening. Today I'm offering 2 amendments, both rooted in things that I thought we all supported, helping families and helping students. But let me start by saying that absolutely there's nothing about this bill that's beautiful. It's actually a big, ugly bill, and probably one of the ugliest that I've seen from this chamber. It's ugly because it hurts people. It's ugly because it punishes children. It punishes students and working families, and it's ugly because it tries to disguise cruelty as reform. Now, my first amendment is about SNAP. We've heard a lot about that. It is the largest and it is the most successful food security program in the nation. It's a lifeline for 49,000 citizens in my district in North Carolina. My SNAP amendment would prevent parents and caregivers of children as young as 7 from losing food assistance if they can't afford child care during the summer months.
Then they should have no problem supporting my amendment.
areas or rural areas. And for the rural areas, sometimes they get treated even worse with no protection from that side of the aisle, who do not consider the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau as important. And so everything that's been said here that have identified not only the $21 billion over the 14 years, but the way that people have had somewhere to turn to get these investigations and feel as if the government cares about them. It's absolutely true.
Thank you so very much.
You're
And
welcome.
then the last point is I did, as we were talking about federal employees and what they're doing to federal employees in this bill, and the fact that we happen to have sitting right next to each other the oversight concerned about federal employees and the defense, right, House Armed Services, because it is our members of the who serve in the military then go on to serve in our country in a different way. 30% of our federal employees are veterans. And the idea that we would not support the amendment that Representative Lynch has brought, that was suggested by my colleague, of let's make sure we protect veterans as well. And, one last question, Ranking Member Smith. Why do you think that so many of our military end up serving America in our federal government?
Because they believe in public service. It's part of why they joined the military in the first place. They believe in service above self. They could do a number of different jobs in a number of different places, but public service appeals to them. I think that's very obvious. It's one of the things I've always loved about working with the military, is you see the ethic that's what it's about. They are trying to serve something larger than themselves, and they want to continue doing that after their service in the military has been completed. And we've seen them do so in many, many places, quite ably.
I think this idea of public service and service, I often say that service is an act of love, whether you're serving in the military, even in this chamber. And the idea that you are going to demonize and penalize those veterans, those federal employees who've already done so much for this country is really shameful. And, I am going to just say that it is now 4:20. And I think it is important that we are on this dais asking the question and taking the time, because this is 1,100 and something page bill. Americans don't know what's in it. And I do think that it is important that we end up going into and bringing light and maybe even sunlight by the time we get through all of these panels. But with that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Leisure Fernandez. Mr. Norman, any questions?
No questions, Madam Chairman.
Thank you very much. Mr. Langworthy?
I just, thank you, Madam Chair. I want to just take a moment and thank all the committee chairs for the countless hours and all the staff and the ranking members on both sides. This was an incredible legislative exercise. They have 11 committees produce this much work and the hundreds and hundreds of hours that have gone into the construction of our reconciliation. So I just want to show my gratitude there. I'd also like to yield a moment to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Scott.
Madam Chair, I just ask unanimous consent to add an article to the record. The title of the article is Clinton Signs Welfare to Work Bill, August 22nd, 1996. And
without objection.
I would just point out to my colleagues that the same complaints about that piece of legislation came from people on the left, including from the Clinton administration, where he had people actually resign in protest. And the article ends with the statement, welfare and poverty rates both declined during the late 1990s. However, leading some observers to view the legislation as a success. And certainly the welfare to work signed under Bill Clinton was a success, and we believe that this one will be as well. With that, I yield.
Thank you. Mr. Griffith?
And I yield back.
Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Langworthy. Thank you.
I don't have any questions of these witnesses.
Thank you very much. Seeing no further discussion or questions, our panel is dismissed. Thank you very much. And I also want to add my thanks to the staff. I appreciate Mr. Langworthy bringing that up. We can't do our jobs without our staff, and I appreciate all of them being here too. You want to make another one? Save it for me, though. Right, jot it down. I now welcome our second panel.
Customs and Border Protection recorded roughly 13 million encounters of inadmissible aliens and gotaways, not counting the unknown gotaways. That number 4 times what happened in the first Trump administration. Border Patrol agents were overwhelmed and demoralized, and they were tasked to process, release tens of thousands of illegal immigrants every month. Apprehensions of individuals on the terrorist watch list illegally crossing the southwest border spiked from 11 during the 4 years of the Trump administration to 385 between FY21 and 24. Illicit narcotics, especially fentanyl, surged across the southwest border, contributing to a national overdose crisis. ICE agents were effectively prevented from doing their jobs, and deportations plummeted to historic lows. But the tide has turned. President Trump was decisively elected, in large part because he promised to fix the self-inflicted crisis created by the prior administration. Now Border Patrol agents have returned to the front lines, empowered to enforce the law. Scores of criminal aliens are being detained and deported, and law and order is finally returning to our communities. The numbers make it clear. President Trump's approach to actually enforcing our laws works. Apprehensions at our borders have plummeted to never-before-seen levels. For example, monthly encounters at the southwest border dropped over 97% from a record high of over 301,000 in December of 23 to less than 8,400 in April of this year. The Trump administration is keeping its promises, and now we in Congress need to keep ours. Just like the president, every Republican ran on securing our border and enforcing our laws. If we fail to provide the necessary funding to the Department of Homeland Security to secure our border and restore law and order, we will show ourselves to be unworthy of the trust placed in us. Every budget recommendation that my committee advanced for inclusion in this bill is critical to maintaining the momentum that we have achieved so far. First, Title VI of this bill provides over $46 billion to finish construction of a strategically placed border barrier system. This system includes not only just steel and concrete bollards, but a full suite of technology and infrastructure such as lights, sensors, cameras, and access roads, giving agents the tools they need to secure the border and do their job safely and effectively. 90% of Border Patrol agents agree that a strategically based border wall system is a key part of their toolkit. Who are we as politicians sitting in our air-conditioned offices to deny them this invaluable resource they say they need? Our reconciliation package also provides $5 billion to improve and modernize Customs and Border Protection checkpoints and facilities. These checkpoints are critical to the border security mission. Reconciliation funding will also be used to invest in frontline personnel by providing more than $7 billion to increase the number of Border Patrol agents, Customs and Border Protection officers, air and marine agents, support staff, and eligible retired agents and officers. Without immediate and sustained investment in workforce expansion and retention, CBP risks further erosion of both effectiveness and morale, endangering not only border security, but also the well-being of those sworn to protect it. Title VI also invests in cutting-edge technology to help agents and officers interdict illicit contraband and drugs like fentanyl. As cartel tactics evolve, Congress must provide CBP with the cutting-edge technology they need to carry out President Trump's successful border security agenda. Our bill invests over $5 billion in modernizing and enhancing our border security and surveillance technologies, drones, ground sensors, enhanced communication systems, and surveillance towers at and between ports of entry. The bill will also provide $450 million to Operation Stone Garden, a grant program designed to help border states and local communities enhance their own security. Republicans are focused on what actually matters, providing proper funding so that DHS law enforcement can carry out their border security mission, protect our country, and secure the homeland. We have a historic opportunity to make the country we love safer and more secure. Let's keep our promises and get reconciliation done. I yield.
Thank you, Chairman Green. Mr. Thompson, you're recognized.
Chairwoman Fox, Ranking Member McGovern, members of the Rules Committee. I normally use this time to thank you for the opportunity to discuss this bill, but this dead of night hearing is one of the most shameful games I've ever seen played on the American public in my nearly 60 years of public service. The Homeland Security title of this scam of a bill was developed without any of the standard oversight and discussion with the Department of Homeland Security that would normally go along with funding numbers so big. The bill recklessly throws an enormous amount of taxpayer money at the border to buy the votes of Republicans who are reluctant to support the massive billionaire tax giveaways and devastating health care cuts that really motivate this piece of legislation. In other words, the Homeland Security title of the bill is like putting lipstick on a pig. But in many ways, the reality of these 9 pages of legislative text is even worse than that, because it steals money from the American taxpayer and gives it to the Trump administration to decimate DHS and attack the Constitution. President Trump and Secretary Noem are unconstitutionally dismantling DHS and making us less safe in the process. They are firing hundreds of civil servants, freezing grants, eliminating the watchdogs who protect Americans, and failing to respond to natural disasters across the country. Several of you have natural disasters ongoing in your district, and you have weekly requests for approval of other natural disasters. Under Trump and Noem, DHS is detaining and deporting American children with cancer, punishing students for engaging in protected First Amendment activity, and denying the due process to individuals, including those in the country legally. When the Trump administration spends its resources harassing, rounding up, and deporting American citizens, legal permanent residents, and international students in the name of border security, it is ignoring real threats from terrorism, domestic violent extremism, and gun violence. Just last weekend, a fertility clinic in Palm Springs, California, was bombed in a domestic terrorist attack. Domestic violent extremism represents one of the biggest threats to the homeland, and this bill doesn't spend a dime on it. It does, however, spend $46.5 billion on Trump's failed border wall, which, I may remind this committee, Trump originally said Mexico would pay for it. That amount for the failed border wall is 10 times what the bill spends on Customs and Border Protection personnel, and it nearly doubles what the Armed Services title of the bill dedicates to the technology complex, so-called Golden Dome Domestic Missile Defense Program. If the Trump administration's cruel policies alone have been as successful as Secretary Noem and Chairman Green like to claim, why are billions and billions of additional funds necessary at all? We got some insight into that question last week when Secretary Noem took a break from her costume changes and photo ops to ask the Appropriation Committee for a new $50 million private jet. See, Rolexes are not enough for our made-for-TV Secretary of Homeland Security. She needs a new Gulfstream 5, too. Never mind that the Coast Guard has much older equipment in service they use daily for life-saving missions. Those aircrafts should be replaced first.
Meaning even with flat premiums, patients pay more out of pocket. So this is not just my opinion. An internal analysis from the first Trump administration warned that these changes will cause coverage losses, premium spikes, and significant market disruption. The administration has also admitted that under this rule, 2 million individuals will lose health care coverage in 2026. This rule is a direct attack on the people that the ACA was designed to protect. It targets working families, low-income individuals, and people with chronic conditions. This rule isn't about integrity, it's about exclusion. So no, we shouldn't codify this harmful rule into law. We should stop it. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment. The second amendment I'd like to discuss today would strike the section of this bill that repeals and rescinds grant funding for reducing air pollution at schools. And I have to repeat this fact. My second amendment would strike the section of this bill, this Republican bill, that repeals and rescinds grant funding for reducing air pollution at schools. At schools. We have an administration that claims to be promoting an agenda that will make our nation and families healthier. As a father and a legislator, there is nothing more important to me than protecting our nation's children. But the bill we are marking up today does the opposite. When parents send their kids to school, the last thing that they should worry about is the air in their children's classrooms. We know that indoor air pollutants pose serious health risks to children, and air pollution can affect educational outcomes. According to data from Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, whose funding the Trump administration has proposed cutting in half, in a classroom of 30 children, 3 are likely to have asthma. One study found a decline in children's test scores for every increase in particulate matter in their school's air, and air quality at schools tends to be worse indoors than it is outside. So what did Democrats do? We created tools to address this challenge. The IRA authorized a grant program that provides essential funding and technical assistance to improve air quality at schools. It seems straightforward to me, even at this hour, why we need this program. Yet Republicans voted against authorizing it 3 years ago. And every Republican on the Energy and Commerce Committee voted against my amendment in our markup last week. Meanwhile, they are cutting Medicaid for nearly 14 million people, and as I mentioned earlier, dismantling critical agencies that are charged with protecting public health. So I'd like my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to explain to me and the American people, how does this bill make our children healthier? How, in cutting these programs, will our children breathe cleaner air? How does making children sick support American families? This issue should be common sense. It should be bipartisan. It should be easy to vote yes on my amendment that preserves this vital program. I appreciate you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. That concludes. Oh, got to do questions. Sorry, getting ahead of myself. Mr. McGovern.
Eating a Swedish fish when you.
I did that on purpose.
Yeah, I know you.
It's going to cost more with tariffs to have the Swedish fish.
But I just want to say to everybody, thank you for being here. Thank you for your patience. I support all your amendments. I'm proud of all of you for coming to this committee and presenting the amendments you did, because I think they represent our values. And as I said at the beginning of this hearing, the underlying bill it doesn't represent my values, doesn't represent our values. And so whatever we can do to help advance your amendments, we will do. But thank you very much. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Ms. Scanlon?
Yes, I echo the ranking member's remarks, and I wanted to particularly thank Representative Sanchez for bringing forward that amendment that is just so despicable in clawing back benefits from children based on who their parents are. It's un-American. That's all I can say.
It also violates the Constitution.
Details.
But that doesn't seem to bother certain
Yeah.
members.
Yeah,
of Congress.
well, I appreciate the amendment. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Now recognize Ms. Ledger-Fernandez.
Thank you very much. And, I noted, Representative Ricardo, that you kind of said something that we are all hearing, right? We keep hearing from Republicans that they don't like this bill. They whisper it to us. They complain about it. But they are so terrified of Trump that they are not having the courage to actually vote no. But we'll see. We'll see. But, with regards to the amendments proposed with regards to immigration, I just wanted to seek unanimous consent to enter into the record an article in Defense One, and Defense One, as you know, is a highly regarded military publication, titled "Immigrants Show Greater Willingness to Join the Military, Study Shows."
Without objection, so ordered.
And another article, I think that goes to Representative Sanchez's points, and there's lots of these different articles, but really the point was made by you, it's been made in some of the earlier panels, but we haven't talked enough about it, and so that's why I wanted to, I know we're trying to move on, but I wanted to take some time to acknowledge that this idea that immigrants are the reason you have to cut Medicaid for everybody because they are somehow gaming the system when they do not receive any federal dollars. And indeed, the article that I would seek unanimous consent to is just one of many that center on budget and policy priorities. Immigrants contribute greatly to the Social Security Trust Fund solvency, which demonstrates, Mr. Chairman, I seek unanimous consent.
What was the date? I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
The date on
It's
the
an
article?
The date of the article on April 23, 2025.
Without objection? So ordered.
Thank you, and thank you for helping clarify that, because I think it's really important that these are recent articles, because they are showing that immigrants' contributions are key. And this one shows that if it weren't for immigrants who pay taxes, but often don't receive any of the benefits, our Social Security would be in deeper trouble than it already is. And you look at that across the board over and over. And so I'm going to introduce these articles, and I know we want to move forward because we have all these wonderful members who are coming here to tell us all the other new things. This is the great thing about these hearings is we're hearing all of these unique factors that you are all bringing to the fact that we are ignoring our cybersecurity. He got rid of Trump. Trump got rid of, right? I mean, you're laughing because I don't even have to say it, right? Because it's shameful that we have made ourselves more at risk because of what he has done in terms of opening up our vulnerabilities to Russia. That's one of your concerns, correct, Representative Matsui? Yeah. Yeah. So thank you very much for raising those. I didn't know if you wanted to do anything else quickly on either of those.
If I could just respond, it is the biggest lie in the world that immigrants take more from the system than they pay in. Immigrants pay into the system, they work hard, they pay taxes, they're not even eligible for those benefits. And yet other Americans are told the reason why there's waste, fraud, and abuse is because of immigrants. It's patently false. It's lies, and it's meant to divide our country. And so the amendments that I'm introducing are trying to strike those provisions that treat immigrants unfairly, immigrants who pay into the system and are not eligible for the benefits.
Yeah, and in this article from Defense One, it's interesting, the articles you start reading, once you get to Congress, like who knew I would start reading military articles? But, that U.S. are more willing to fight for their country. And what they're fighting for, as it goes in to discuss, is the ideals of the country, the ideals of the Constitution. And that is something that I think we need to remember, that we're dealing with a tax bill and cutting essential benefits, but they are wrapping it around elements that are undermining the ideals of this country as a place where we create opportunity for everybody, whether you're native born from West Virginia or you're an immigrant or married in. I would only suggest that, and maybe I could discuss it with you later, the idea that it should be any family who is not just the spouse, but also the children who are married into the military. But with that, you wanted to say something?
I just want to just join my colleague, Congresswoman Matsui, to your point about cybersecurity. I mean, this is, when I was on Homeland Security on the Cybersecurity Subcommittee, this was something that had bipartisan support. And this is something that we should all be in agreement on. Yeah. We're watching an administration dismantle CISA and our cybersecurity workforce at a time that we need to be growing it. And instead of having a strong federal response to all the attacks that we're seeing both in private and public sector to our critical infrastructure, we're saying that the states and municipalities have to handle it when they don't have the resources to. And so I appreciate Congresswoman Matsui's leadership on this issue and her amendment, because it is something that should have bipartisan support, because it has historically had bipartisan support, because it's an issue of national security. And the fact that we can't agree on this amendment, that everyone in the administration, especially when you're enabling people from DOJ to have access to some of the most sensitive personal data of all Americans, right, from red and blue states across the country, whether it's HUD or the VA or the IRS, we should have some level of cybersecurity awareness and training for those individuals. So I thank the Congresswoman for her leadership on this issue, and it should be something that should have bipartisan support, and I thank you for raising it as well.
Thank you very much. And once again, we aren't hearing any Republicans complain about any of the kind of transgressions that would have normally had an outcry, a bipartisan outcry. But with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Now I recognize Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And there are legitimate differences of opinion on different issues. Many of my friends are Democrats. I travel with them overseas. We have different ideas about how to solve the same problem. So there are legitimate questions, differences about how we would handle the issues. But I can tell you, as someone who's in the rooms where there are no telephones, where we're dealing with the cybersecurity related issues, there's no breakdown on the cybersecurity right now. There's just not. So we can have our debates and our differences of opinion, but I can tell you this. The administration is committed on cybersecurity, just as I believe the previous administration was committed on cybersecurity. And it's just a we have differences of agreements on other things, but that's the one that I've listened to that I think that accusation is just, as someone who's in the room, I very much think that's a false accusation.
Can I comment on
Mr.
that?
Chair, I yield the remainder of my time. I'm not interested in a debate on it.
Gentleman has yielded back, and I understand we can do this, but I'm looking at possibly 2 more panels before we finish, and so happy for y'all to have a conversation and discussion and disagreement, but this panel is concluded. Thank you. I note this response will be noted. Thank you. And what we've been trying to do is when I start calling off the names for the next panel, it'll be starting on this end with chair number 1, Mr. Khanna, Ms. McClellan, Mr. Courtney, Mr. Frost, Ms. Brownlee, Mr. Magaziner, Mr. Garamendi, and Ms. Elfrith. All right, I know it's still a little busy, but if we can go ahead and get started. Mr. Khanna of California, are you ready? He's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a common sense bipartisan amendment. No American child under the age of 18 should lose their health care because of this bill. As you know, 42% of America's children rely on Medicaid. The chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee said, no one is going to lose their health care. No kids are going to lose their health care. President Trump keeps saying it's all about waste, fraud, and abuse. We're just going after waste, fraud, and abuse. Representative Crenshaw says no kids are going to lose their health insurance. And a number of Republicans wrote in a letter to the Speaker that they should make sure no kids lose their health insurance. But the reality is, independent estimates are that 800,000 kids in this country are going to lose their health care. I think we can all agree that any child born in America should have health care. So if the Republicans agree that kids shouldn't lose health care, why not just have a simple amendment in this bill saying we guarantee that no kid is going to lose health care? Now you ask, why is it that kids are going to lose health care? Why the estimates of 800,000? The reality is that the work requirements were tried in Arkansas, And what they saw is when parents were kicked off health care because of bureaucratic reasons, the kids lost the health care too. It's not theoretical. Thousands of kids in Arkansas lost their health care. And this to me seems like the easiest way that we can answer this question. Just guarantee to the American public that not a single American kid is going to lose health care with this bill. And that would answer the question. It would make good on all of the promises. It would make good on the promise that Trump is saying it's only waste, fraud, and abuse. He certainly doesn't want to deprive American kids born here of health care. Let me end with this point. I was in Allentown. There was a 6th grader. She stood up and she said her name was Sophia. I won't say her last name, but her name was Sophia. And she said, "I'm scared. I'm scared. Can you assure me that I won't be afraid?" And she said she's afraid because her grandmother is on Medicare. And she said she's afraid because she's a single mother is raising her. And she was concerned about her own health care. I want this amendment to pass so I can tell Sophia she doesn't have to be afraid about losing her own health care. And kids like Sophia should not be afraid of losing their health care across this country.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman yields back, and now recognize the gentlelady from Virginia, Ms. McClellan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Ranking Member McGovern for allowing further amendments to this bill. I think so. Okay. My amendment would ensure that the proceeds of any spectrum licensing, allocation, or auction won't line the pockets of the president, a special government official, any other government official, or their families. It would also ensure that the FCC does not collude with the president or any other government official or their family to influence the outcomes of their personal legal battles. But spoiler alert, this amendment's probably not going to pass. So I want to take the rest of my time to talk about this big bad billionaire bonus that benefits the wealthiest 10% of Americans at the expense of the poorest 10%. It shifts costs to states that are already struggling to fill massive holes that they are seeing from the Trump administration's funding freezes. They are trying to take on the burden of more responsibility shifted to them, whether from the Department of Education or these new work requirements, or now to pay for nutrition benefits for the first time ever. States are going to be left in the untenable position of having to raise their own taxes or gutting even more services as a result. This bill does nothing to address the underlying costs of health care, child care, groceries, energy bills, or anything else. And why are we rushing through this bill to the point where the bulk of it is being discussed in the middle of the night while everybody else is sleeping? What is the rush? Are the wealthiest few in that big of a hurry to get richer? Is there a flash sale on yachts that I don't know about? We've had these markups in the middle of the night that include provisions that Republicans didn't even know about. Like the Republicans on the Energy and Commerce Committee who were caught off guard by the Medicaid provisions imposing copays of up to $35 on an individual who earns up to $300 a week. They didn't know that if somebody was kicked off of Medicaid because they couldn't meet burdensome work paper requirements to prove that they're working, like the 18,000 Arkansas individuals who were kicked off when they couldn't meet work requirements even though they were working, these folks that get kicked off wouldn't be eligible for subsidies to purchase marketplace plans that they otherwise couldn't afford. And that came as a surprise to my colleagues in the E&C committee in the middle of the night. And somewhere between the E&C marathon markup and here, a provision was added that would cut the federal match for Medicaid in states that dare to provide health care to lawfully present immigrants. That means that Virginia, that covers lawfully present pregnant women and children, could face a cut in the federal match that would trigger an unwinding of Medicaid expansion that would cost hundreds of thousands of Virginians their health insurance, put our providers, especially our rural hospitals, at risk of closing their doors. Now I heard there'll be at least one manager's amendment that might fix that. But who knows? Who knows what will happen Once the Freedom Caucus, I think they've already returned from the White House, but who knows what they've demanded and what they've gotten. And they want to kick even more people off of their health insurance. But what else is buried in this bill? What's going to be buried in the manager's amendment? What's going to be buried in the bill that we see for the first time on the floor that we won't have time to take back to stakeholders or the American people? And will this be another one of those moments where we rush through a big, massive bill and then hope that the Senate saves the House from its worst impulse? Plain and simple, I ask again, what's the rush? What is the rush of a bill that will harm children? That will say to a family, now even though you legally cannot leave your child at home when they're 7, 8, 9, 10, we're going to assume that you can go to work once they reach 7. Even though I can tell you when my son was 7, if left at home to take care of himself, he probably would have burned the house down. Have we thought through? Have we thought through the unintended consequences of some of the provisions that are buried in this bill, surprising even Republicans that don't like them? I hope we take our time, we do this right, because if we mess it up, the harm is not going to be to us. It's going to be to the most vulnerable that we represent. And with that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Now recognize Mr. Courtney of Connecticut for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member McGovern and all the members of the panel. I have a simple, straightforward amendment focused on the Air Force One program, which falls under the jurisdiction of the Sea Power and Projection Forces Subcommittee of the House Armed Services, on which I serve as ranking member. This amendment would prohibit funds made available by this act from being used for the purpose of modifying an aircraft acquired from a foreign source for use as executive airlift aircraft or for transferring such aircraft to a non-governmental entity such as a museum. This provision is in response to the President's sudden decision to accept a Boeing 747 from Qatar to serve as a so-called bridge replacement for the current Air Force One aircraft. The White House has portrayed this idea as a free Air Force One plane. Nothing could be further from the truth. I can say this with complete certainty because in 2018, during the first Trump administration, Congress authorized the purchase of 2 Boeing 747 aircraft that Boeing had originally built as commercial passenger planes for an airline that went bankrupt. The cost of upgrades and retrofitting for these 2 planes to replace the Air Force One fleet totaled $3.9 billion. The work included stripping the plane's interior down to the studs, hardening the plane's defenses, installing encrypted communications technology, and building out space for what is essentially a flying command and control center, not just for our nation's military and intelligence agency, but for the entire federal government. Earlier this month, Acting Assistant Secretary of the Air Force, Darlene Costello, testified before our subcommittee that Boeing has a workable plan for the Air Force to deliver these 2 planes by 2027. It's important to note that the final cost at this point has already exceeded $3.9 billion to the tune of millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars of cost overruns. A few hours ago, the White House confirmed that the President has unilaterally accepted a 3rd plane. We've all seen the pictures of this aircraft that is not even close to being ready to fly as Air Force One, and clearly it's going to require much of the same time and expense to be stripped down and upgraded as the 2 jets already under contract with the Air Force, which are on track for delivery during the President's current term. This scheme was not free, and the new scheme is not going to be free either. It's going to cost the taxpayers a lot of money. The relevance to this reconciliation package is that the armed services provisions, the $150 billion for the Department of Defense, was allocated under Title II of the U.S. Code, which has little or no controls on how funds are going to be used across programs, unlike Title 31, which safeguards the execution of congressional appropriations. And again, during the markup, we had a lot of back and forth with committee staff about the fact that the Office of Management and Budget is going to be basically free to spend that $150 billion with little or no controls or restraint. And we know that this budget director from the first Trump administration was brazenly reprogramming money with no congressional authorization over and over again. Madam Chair, there are a host of other reasons for Congress to approve this amendment, particularly the constitutional prohibition in Article 1, Section 9, Clause 8, that bars any official from accepting gifts or emoluments from another government without approval of Congress. Obviously, Congress has not even come close to approving this gift. That prohibition, as well as the significant cost of retrofitting a third Air Force One, screams out for Congress to exercise its constitutional duty and put the brakes on this scheme. My amendment will do that, and I respectfully ask my colleagues to make it in order. And Madam Chair, I have an article from Forbes magazine, hardly a Democratic media outlet, titled "Why the Qataris Are Happy to Dump Their 747 on Trump," dated May 15th.
Without objection.
Thank you. I
It'll be
yield
made a
back.
part of the record. Okay, I'm just going by the list given to me, so but if you want to go in order yourself, you're fine. I'm fine with it.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair, Ranking Member McGovern, and members of the committee. Thank you for spending nearly 20 hours at this hard work. I greatly appreciate it. I'm sure everybody on this panel does, discussing many of the very concerning cuts and policy implications of this bill, staring down policies that will result in as many as 14 million people losing their health insurance and food assistance, the elimination of IRA provisions aimed at lowering energy costs, adding trillions of dollars to the deficit, which we only just found out a few hours ago from CBO, which will trigger $500 billion in Medicare cuts, all to pay for tax breaks for the wealthiest Americans and corporations. I'm here to request the committee accept the following two amendments aimed at protecting our national security, Amendment 102 and 108. First, Amendment 102 is a common sense provision recommended by the DoD itself to protect our national security and ensure military readiness when considering coastal leases for sale. The bill before us proposes a fire sale on public lands and waters to the lowest bidders for the purpose of more drilling, and yet offers no guarantee that any of those resources will benefit Americans or lower energy costs. On the House Natural Resources Committee, we often talk about national security and how our ability to produce our own energy allows us not to rely on foreign adversaries, but selling off our coastal waters surrounding our military installations directly contradicts these efforts and instead endangers our national security by prohibiting the military's ability to train and navigate freely. And here's how I know this, because in 2015, the DoD analyzed every offshore drilling block in their roles and activities critical for military readiness and national security, and they determined that what, if any, level of drilling activity can be done without impeding their critical work. My amendment would require the federal government to implement the findings of this DoD report when selling offshore drilling leases for coastal waters. Due to the sensitive training and work of it at our installations, all of these blocks on the east and west coasts were classified by DoD as requiring either a total prohibition or very specific conditions for leasing. But even if everything on these drilling sites were to go exactly as planned, the mere presence of these rigs would cause immediate threats to our military readiness and national security, and that's just not a risk we should be willing to take. I implore this committee to address the very real threat by supporting this amendment. My second amendment before you, Amendment 180, as was just discussed by my colleague, we understand that the bill provides extra $150 billion to the DoD, and frankly, I don't trust the Secretary with $150, let alone $150 billion. But my second amendment, preservation of historical items, is very simple. It prohibits the DoD from spending any of these funds until a panel of experts reviews all artifacts and documents flagged for destruction and censorship. Earlier this year, the DoD, under the direction of Secretary Hegseth, began removing books, images, and stories of historical events and heroes from our military academies. The department removed these items as part of a crusade against what they consider promoting, quote, divisive concepts. Yet protecting the history and accurately telling the stories of our nation is critical to our national security. It's concerning that under Secretary Hegseth's guidance, the DoD has removed images and stories often by mistake. We all read the headlines of articles and images highlighting the accomplishments of the Navajo code talkers who fought in the Pacific Island campaign that were removed. Pictures of the Enola Gay, the plane that dropped the atomic bomb in Japan, were removed because of the word gay. At the U.S. Naval Academy in my own district, we've seen nearly 400 books from their libraries removed that explored themes of gender, race, and diversity. Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings was removed, yet Hitler's Mein Kampf and Mussolini's The Doctrine of Fascism remain. We are spending precious time, energy, and resources on erasing the history of our great nation instead of preparing for the next conflict or taking seriously the handling of sensitive national security information. A military that looks like our country and receives an education that teaches the accurate history of this nation is critical to our ability to influence strong democratic principles abroad. If our service members don't learn from history, they are doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past. I urge support for both of these amendments and yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Ms. Elfreth. Mr. Frost, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to testify. I got here at 1 a.m., and when I pulled up, I was surprised to see a crowd of about 150, maybe 175 people right outside the Capitol steps protesting this bill and protesting cuts to Medicaid, protesting cuts to food assistance. And I started walking around and speaking with people, and I found folks who were here from all across the nation, of all different ages, all different ethnicities, races, religions. I met Democrats, I met Republicans, I met independents, I met people who aren't registered to vote. And the word I heard from people the most, especially, it started to rain, we stayed out there talking to people, the word I heard the most was betrayal. And people felt betrayed. And a lot of these folks had already planned this trip to D.C. for a long time. They didn't even know that this vote would go on. But when they found out that the Republican majority would be hosting a key hearing on this budget, which the budget shows the morals of a nation and the character of a nation, and they heard it was happening at 1 a.m. in the middle of the night, these people in the middle of their vacation, their advocacy trips on other things and all this, decided to come out in the rain with their families to say, we don't want to be betrayed. We want our health care. We want the nutritional assistance. We want a budget that reflects the values of this country. And we don't want a bill that will facilitate the single largest transfer of wealth from the working poor and the working class to the ultra wealthy in the history of our nation. It's dark and twisted that many Republican politicians want to take away health care, make food more expensive, restrict the child tax credit, all to enrich billionaires and mega corporations. If this bill passes, kids will go hungry. If this bill passes, people will die. And I heard this directly from people that were out there protesting, talking about the impacts that these cuts to Medicaid would have on their lives and their children. I also know this bill's unpopular because I've been traveling this country, going to Republican districts and speaking with constituents who have a Republican representative who refuses to host the town hall. I was actually in Michigan because in Representative John James' districts, one of his constituents shared, quote, "My daughter's a young woman who was born with cerebral palsy, mild cognitive impairments, and autism. She depends on Medicaid services for her health, safety, and well-being. She's unable to work or take care of herself. Without Medicaid, she is totally at risk. Cutting Medicaid to give tax cuts to wealthy billionaires is not only cruel and unethical, but it puts vulnerable people like my daughter at risk of severe mental and physical health problems." I'm in this hearing